Every night, he walks the exact same 3 streets, always at the same hour. He leaves one warm parcel at 3 doors and never knocks. No names, no thanks. No one even knows he was there. But somewhere in foggy London, a window stays lit a little longer because someone keeps finding warmth on the doorstep. It was not the grandness of Christmas that stayed with Scrooge after it had passed, but the quiet that followed, the particular hush that arrives when a city has spent its last bright breath and must return to its ordinary lungs. London, on the morning after the holiday, seemed to exhale through soot-stained chimneys and damp brickwork, as if relieved to be itself again. The streets wore their winter plainly. Puddles held thin skins of ice along the curb, and the day's light, weak and careful, could not quite warm the stones. Yet, in the narrow room Scrooge now called his own, smaller than the chambers he once occupied, though warmer in its modesty, there was a steady fire, and with it, a steadier man. He had risen early, not from the old itch to count and chase, but from a different restlessness, the kind that belongs to those who have discovered, late, that they may live otherwise and are still learning how to arrange their hours around gentleness. He sat near the hearth with his hands loosely clasped, watching the fire's small movements as though they might teach him something about patience. The room held the soft, familiar smells of ash and tea, and also a faint trace of paper, for he had been collecting sheets of wrapping from the shops he passed, not yet certain why. A coal scuttle sat by the grate, a kettle rested on the trivet, and near the window a simple coat stand waited like a quiet servant. Nothing here glittered, nothing insisted upon itself. Scrooge found that he preferred it so. The old life had been full of shining surfaces and hard edges, metal that rang, ledgers that snapped shut, doors that closed too firmly, and in its place he wanted textures that yielded wool, paper, wax, steam. He had learned, with a kind of sober astonishment, that warmth could be made deliberately, as one might lay kindling and wait for flame. If he could not undo what he had been, perhaps he could at least choose what he would do, and choose it with enough care that the choosing itself became a form of atonement. Yet atonement, he discovered, could be noisy. Kindness in daylight had a way of attracting faces, gratitude, questions, and in those questions, there was always the possibility of his old self returning the impulse to measure, to bargain, to take some secret pride in being seen. He did not trust that impulse. He did not trust his own heart. Not entirely, not yet. So he began, in the days after Christmas, to devise rules for himself, the way a cautious man might devise rules for a diet, not to punish, but to protect what was newly fragile. The first rule came simply: no names. He would not ask who needed what, nor allow himself the comfort of knowing whom he had helped. The second rule followed: no credit. He would not stand at thresholds, nor linger to catch the soft shock of surprise. He would not knock. He would leave, and in leaving, he would let the gift remain pure of his presence. The third rule, which settled into him with a strange calm, was the shape of the night itself. The route, London was vast, but habit could make it small. He chose, with deliberate restraint, one fixed path through streets he knew well enough to walk without haste. A circle, not too long, with 3 places where one might pause without being noticed. A shop that opened late enough for a quiet purchase, an alley that held a single window that often stayed lit beyond reasonable hours, and a lodging house whose common room hearth, he remembered, burned fitfully but faithfully when the keeper could afford it. 3 stops, no more. 3 was enough to be meaningful and not enough to become a performance. 3 was the number that had visited him in the night when time had turned its face toward him and demanded an answer. He would make this new 3 into something steadier, something lived rather than feared. He would take from the memory of that haunting, not the terror, but the structure, a sequence, a boundary, a return. On the first evening, he resolved to try. He did not carry Parcels at all. He dressed as the ordinary men did, dark coat, plain scarf, hat pulled low, and left his rooms as twilight thickened into the familiar London dusk. Gas lamps were already shaking their small halos in the moist air, and the fog, low and patient, began to gather as though summoned by the hour. Scrooge walked slowly, listening. The city's sounds were not loud here, not in these streets. The distant rattle of a carriage, the softer shush of footsteps on damp stone, the occasional cough from behind a shuttered window. He had walked London all his life, but always with a purpose that narrowed his sight. Tonight, his purpose was to look without taking, to notice without demanding. The shop he had marked an old bakery, whose windows glowed warmly against the dim street, smelled of butter and yeast even through the glass, and he paused there, not to enter, but to observe the rhythm of the place, the careful stacking of tins, the slow folding of paper, the unhurried patience of hands that knew their craft. He turned away before he could be seen lingering, and continued. The alley came next, a narrow vein between taller buildings where the fog pressed close to the bricks and muffled the sound of his steps. Halfway down, a single window was lit, as it often was. It was nothing remarkable, only the soft rectangle of light falling onto the street, and behind it the suggestion of movement, a shadow crossing and returning. Yet Scrooge found himself stopping, drawn not by curiosity, but by a feeling that this was one of the city's quiet truths, a small sign of life that did not need him and would not be improved by his interference. Somewhere inside, a kettle began to boil, a thin singing sound that threaded through the glass and out into the night. He stood just long enough to register the sound, as one might register a heartbeat, and then moved on, letting the alley close behind him like a thought released. The lodging house sat at the edge of his chosen circle, its doorway worn by many hands and its windows dimmed by years of smoke. In the common room he did not enter. He had no desire to become a figure of disturbance. Instead, he paused across the street, where he could see the faint orange of firelight through a lower pane and the silhouettes of men shifting in their chairs. There was a steadiness in that small fire, a stubborn insistence on warmth even when warmth was scarce, and Scrooge felt something loosen in his chest, not quite pity and not quite guilt, but a sober recognition of how many winters were endured without ceremony, without relief. He turned then and walked home, completing his circle with the peculiar satisfaction of a task that was not yet a task, a pattern traced into the night. Back in his room, the fire had settled into coals, and the kettle gave a contented murmur as he set it on again. He removed his coat carefully, hung it on the stand, and stood for a time with his hands resting on the back of a chair, letting the heat reach him through the fabric. He realized, with a clarity that was almost tender, that the route itself had soothed him. The repetition had made something in his mind quiet, as though the city's chaos could be held at bay by a simple, chosen order. If he was to leave Parcels, he would do it this way, always the same circle, always the same 3 pauses, so that his giving would not become a storm, but a gentle weather, expected and steady. The next morning, when the light came pale through the window, and the streets outside began their daily scrape and murmur, Scrooge went out again, this time in full daylight, and made his way to a stationer's shop he had once used only for account books and harsh ink. He stepped inside and stood among shelves of paper, leather, and pens, feeling oddly unguarded. The clerk, seeing only a well-dressed older gentleman, asked what he desired. Scrooge asked, after a brief pause, for a thick ledger, one that would not curl with damp, one that would lie open without resistance, one that would last. The clerk brought several. Scrooge ran his fingers along their spines, testing the give of the bindings. the roughness of the paper edges. He chose a volume bound in brown leather with a quiet grain, sturdy without being showy, and paid without haggling. Though haggling had once been a habit he cherished as if it were virtue. He carried the ledger home beneath his arm as though it were something that required protection from the cold. In his room, he set it on the wooden table by the hearth, opened it, and let the fresh paper breathe. The fountain pen, another purchase, made with a deliberateness that surprised him, felt unfamiliar in his hand, for he had long relied on instruments that scratched quickly and demanded no grace. He tested the ink, watched the line darken into certainty, and then, at the top of the first page, he wrote the title with careful, even strokes, Warm Parcel Route. The words looked almost too gentle for him, as if they belonged to another man. But he did not flinch. He underlined them once, not with emphasis, but with neatness, the simple satisfaction of setting a thing in order. Below the title, he wrote 3 small marks, spaced as if leaving room for breath. Stop 1, stop 2, stop 3. He did not write names. He did not write addresses. He wrote only descriptions that would be enough for him to find the places again, and vague enough to protect those who lived there. For the first, he wrote, after a moment's thought, the bakery window that glows late. For the second, the house with the window lit beyond midnight. For the third, the lodging house hearth chair. He looked at the page a long time, letting the ink dry and the idea settle. It was a simple beginning, and that simplicity calmed him. He closed the ledger softly, as one closes a door without slamming, and placed it beside the fire where the warmth could reach it. Then he rose, made himself tea, and sat with the cup between his hands, feeling the steady heat seep into his palms. Outside, London moved as it always did, hurried where it must be, indifferent where it could afford to be. But in this small room, with its gentle fire and its new book of promises, Scrooge felt the first true shape of his ritual take hold. Tonight he would walk the route again, but not empty-handed. Tonight he would carry warmth wrapped in paper and twine, and he would leave it quietly, like a softening of the air. He would not ask to be forgiven. He would not ask to be thanked. He would only do the work of making the night a little kinder 3 times over, and then return home to write one plain line in a ledger that no one else would ever need to see. By late afternoon, the light in Scrooge's room had taken on that winter thinness, which makes even familiar objects seem a shade farther away, as though the day were politely withdrawing. He drew the curtains before the last of it could leak out, and when the fabric fell into place, the room became a small, contained world. Firelight at the hearth, a table cleared of everything but what belonged to the evening's work, and the steady quiet that comes when one is alone without feeling lonely. The ledger lay closed beside his elbow, its leather cover warmed by proximity to the coals. He did not open it yet. He had found, in the short span since Christmas, that anticipation could spoil an act meant to be simple. If he looked too early at the page, he might begin to imagine outcomes and faces and stories that did not belong to him. First, there must be preparation, as orderly and unhurried as setting the kettle on a trivet, as plain as folding a cloth. On the table, he arranged the parcels as one might arrange a modest supper. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would turn generosity into display, but each thing chosen with care. There was a tin of butter biscuits properly buttered. He had been assured by the baker's wife the day before, and sealed tight enough to keep their crumb tender against the damp. There was a small packet of black tea wrapped in brown paper, the leaves inside dry and fragrant in a way that suggested both warmth and wakefulness. There was also a wool scarf in a color like oats in winter light, soft without being showy, the sort of wool that held warmth close and asked no questions. Beside these, he set a single sheet of good writing paper and an envelope of the same, plain and clean and slightly textured beneath his fingertips. He had thought, for an absurd moment, of buying something ornate, embossed edges, gold lines, but the very notion had made him uncomfortable, as if ornament were a form of attention-seeking. He chose instead what was quiet, and in that quiet, he felt his own thoughts settle. He filled the pen, tested the nib, and wrote slowly, letting each word arrive with its own weight. The letter was not long, because long letters carry an expectation of reply. This one was meant to be a small warmth, like placing a hand briefly on someone's shoulder and then stepping away. For the night, he wrote, and after a pause, "May you rest as though the world is kind." He considered adding his name, then stopped himself. Names were hooks, names caught in the mind and pulled, and he had promised himself no pulling, no tethering. Beneath the message, he wrote only, "No reply needed," and as he set down the pen, he felt the relief of a rule followed, the steadiness of restraint. Wrapping took time in the way that soothing tasks often do. He cut paper carefully, measured folds, and pressed each seam with the flat of his palm so the parcel would lie snug and sure. Cream-colored paper suited the evening. It looked warm even before it touched the firelight. He tied dark twine around the tin and the tea, twice around, once across, and knotted it with the simple competence of someone who did not wish the knot to become a flourish. The scarf he folded into a rectangle, smoothed once more, and wrapped in paper that was slightly thicker so the wool would not snag. For the envelope, he used no ribbon at all, only the clean closure of the flap. At the end, when all three were done, he took a stick of sealing wax he had found in an old drawer unused for years. Its purpose once tied to stern business letters, and held it to the flame until the wax softened into a bead. The red that formed at the tip was not the red of ceremony. It was the red of contained heat, as though the fire had agreed to lend him a small portion of itself. He pressed the wax onto the twine's knot and stamped it with a plain seal, not a crest, only a simple mark. The seal was not for grandeur. It was, he told himself, for keeping the warmth in. When he was ready, he stood for a moment with the parcels gathered in his arms, feeling their small weight, the quiet promise of them. Outside, evening had deepened into full night. The gas lamps beyond his curtain threw a faint tremble of light along the edge of the fabric, and somewhere down the street, a carriage wheel found a rut and made a brief, muffled complaint. Scrooge pulled on his coat, wound his own scarf at his throat, and took his hat from its peg. Before he left, he hesitated at the table and opened the ledger, just enough to see the first page. The ink of the title had dried to a patient brown black. Beneath it, the 3 stops waited like 3 empty bowls. He read the second description, the house with the window lit beyond midnight, and felt a small tightening in his chest. Not fear, but an awareness of how easily rules could become excuses. He closed the book again and turned the key in the lock with care, as if he were not leaving a room but stepping out of a private vow. London at night did not rush him. That, perhaps, was what he liked about it now. In his earlier years, the city had seemed to demand speed, money to be made, debts to be collected, time to be squeezed dry. Tonight, it moved at its own winter pace, and he moved with it, his steps unhurried on the damp stone. Fog lay low, but not thick enough to blind. It softened the corners of buildings and made the halos of gaslight rounder, gentler. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet wool, and when he passed other pedestrians, they kept to themselves, faces turned inward as though each carried their own small burden of cold. No one looked twice at him. He was grateful for the invisibility. The first stop on his route, the bakery glowed like a held breath. Through the window, he could see the counter, the shelves, the tins, and behind them, the baker himself, moving slowly in his shirt sleeves, wiping down a board with the same steady rhythm one might use to soothe a child. The bell above the door gave a restrained tinkle when Scrooge entered, and warm air, heavy with butter and sugar, wrapped around him at once. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to. The baker greeted him with a nod that was more question than welcome, and Scrooge asked for a tin of the butter biscuits, and after a moment, another packet of black tea, though he had already brought one with him. It seemed wise, he decided, to have an extra warmth on hand. The night might ask for it in ways he could not foresee. The baker set the tin on the counter and wrapped it in paper that made a soft, satisfying rustle. He tied twine and tightened it, and the tin gave a gentle click when it settled, a sound that felt almost comforting in its solidity. Scrooge watched the man's hands, noticing the unhurried competence, the plain care. There was a kind of dignity in such work, a dignity he had once overlooked because it did not show in numbers. He paid, thanked the baker without elaboration, and stepped back into the night with the parcel tucked under his arm, the warmth of the shop still lingering against his face. The route carried him next through quieter streets, where the fog thickened into a mild veil. He turned into the narrow alley he had marked, and there, exactly as he remembered, the single window remained lit. The light fell in a soft rectangle across the damp stones, bright enough to paint the fog and make it look like breath. Scrooge slowed. He did not stop under the window. That felt too near, too intimate, and intimacy was not what he was offering. Instead, he moved to the side, where an old step jutted from the brick, half sheltered by the angle of the wall. He set down the tin of biscuits and the tea together, as if they belonged, and placed the envelope on top, protected by the slight ridge of the paper. The parcels looked strangely modest there, like a child's offering, and yet, in their modesty, they felt right. From behind the window came the sound he had heard the night before, the kettle's thin song as it approached boiling. There was movement in the light, a shadow passing, pausing. Scrooge's heart gave a quiet, unasked-for thump, and he took one step back, then another, letting the darkness reclaim him. He did not knock. He did not wait for the door to open. He allowed the gift to exist without his presence, and in that choice, there was a calmness that surprised him, as though he had finally set down something heavy. The third stop brought him to the lodging house. Here the air was different, more human, more layered with the smells of damp clothes, cheap tobacco, thin stew. The building itself seemed to hunch against the cold, its doorway scuffed and its windows filmed with grime. Scrooge crossed the street to avoid the immediate pool of light at the entrance, and walked instead along the side where a narrow passage led toward the back. He knew, from watching on his earlier walk, that a small side door was sometimes left unlatched for the keeper's convenience. Tonight it was, and he slipped inside quietly, moving as a shadow moves when it means no harm. The common room lay just beyond, warmed by a low fire that snapped occasionally as though even the coals were weary. Men sat close to it, shoulders rounded, hands extended toward the heat, faces turned down. No one looked up. The room was not silent, but its sounds were subdued. A cough, the scrape of a chair leg, the low murmur of two voices that did not wish to be overheard. Scrooge kept to the edge, where the wall cast deeper shadow, and there he saw the chair. He had noted an old wooden seat close enough to the hearth to be coveted, but at the moment empty, perhaps because its occupant had stepped away. He took the folded scarf from his arm, its paper already softened by the warmth of his body, and set it neatly on the chair's seat, as though leaving a place setting for someone who would arrive hungry. For a moment, he stood there, breathing in the room's mingled air, feeling the strange pull of wanting to do more, to lay out blankets for all of them, to pour soup, to press coins into hands. But he had made rules, and the rules were not there to limit kindness. They were there to keep it from swelling into something that required applause. 3 stops, 1 route, a steady circle. He turned before his hesitation could become a performance, slipped back through the side passage, and returned to the street where the fog met him like a familiar shawl. When he reached home, the warmth of his own room greeted him with an almost domestic tenderness. He hung his coat on the stand, the fabric settling with a soft weight, and stood for a moment to listen to the quiet. The faint pop of coal, the distant hush of London beyond the glass. He put the kettle on, and while it warmed, he removed his hat and set it carefully aside, as though order itself were part of the ritual. Only then did he open the ledger. The page waited, clean and patient, under the lamplight. He wrote the date in the margin, and beneath it, in a single line that felt both small and important, he wrote, "No one needs to know. Only the night must soften." Then he set down the pen, poured himself tea, and let the steam rise slowly, as if the room were breathing along with him, as if London, somewhere out there beyond the fog, had been given permission just a little to rest. The following evening arrived with a steadier cold, as if the weather, having tested London once, now felt certain it could press a little harder. Scrooge sensed it before he opened the door, in the way the window panes held a faint, tight sheen, and the air in the room leaned closer to the fire. He had spent the day in quiet preparation, not the feverish industry of his former years, but a gentle arranging of objects and intentions, so that when dusk settled, he would not be tempted into haste. The first night's route had left him oddly calm, as though repetition were a kind of shelter, and he found himself craving that shelter again. The familiar circle of streets, the 3 measured pauses, the return to a room that waited for him without questions. He lit the lamp early, not for brightness, but for steadiness, and set his table as he had done before, clearing away anything that did not belong to the ritual. The ledger remained closed at his elbow, its presence reassuring rather than demanding, and beside it, he placed the items he had chosen. A pair of wool-lined gloves, plain and dark, and 2 beeswax candles wrapped in simple paper, their pale gold color holding a suggestion of summer stored in solid form. Beeswax, he had discovered, possessed a warmth that did not shout. It smelled faintly of honey and clean comb, and when held near a flame, it softened as though it remembered what it had once been. He set the candles on a small dish close to the hearth, not too near to deform them, but near enough that their surface lost the day's chill. The gloves he warmed differently, laying them over the back of a chair by the fire, so that they gathered heat slowly, as a body gathers it after coming in from the street. There was something quietly intimate about warming gloves for someone he would not meet. It felt less like charity and more like common sense, a practical answer to the simple fact that winter required covering. He checked the seams, ran his fingertips along the lining, and felt the soft give of wool that would not scratch. Then he folded them carefully, the way a person folds their own things when they have learned, perhaps late, that care is a form of respect. The wrapping went more quickly than the first night, though he did not allow it to become careless. Paper, cut cleanly, made a sound like restrained snowfall. Twine tightened with a small sigh. He tied ribbon only once, a narrow strip he had found in a drawer, and even then he made the knot plain, a knot meant to hold rather than decorate. When he sealed the final fold, he used a touch of wax, not the wax of his stamp, but a small drop melted from the candle itself pressed to the paper so that it would stay shut without fuss. He liked the thought that the candle contributed to its own containment, as though it agreed to be carried and placed and found. When at last the parcels sat ready, simple and compact, he took a moment to breathe in the room's warmth. The faint scent of tea from the earlier kettle, the iron tang of coal, the quiet perfume of paper. He drew on his coat, wound his scarf, and stepped into the evening with the parcels held close, as if he were protecting something more delicate than wax and wool. London met him with fog that was thinner than the night before, but sharper at the edges. Gas lamps trembled slightly in the damp, their halos smaller, as though even the light had learned to conserve itself. Scrooge walked at his chosen pace, unhurried, attentive, neither skulking nor announcing, allowing the rhythm of his steps to calm the mind's tendency to wander. He passed the bakery as part of his circle, though tonight it was not his first stop, and the familiar warmth behind the glass felt like a nod from an acquaintance. His route, he realized, was becoming a kind of spine for the night, a structure around which small acts could settle without collapsing into sentiment. He wanted, with almost stubborn simplicity, to keep the spine straight. 3 stops, 3 parcels, no names, no credit, a return. It was a discipline, but not a harsh one. It was the discipline of keeping something gentle from being spoiled. The chandler's shop lay along a street that seemed to hold light differently, with narrow windows that threw soft rectangles onto the pavement. From outside, the shop appeared modest, no lavish displays, only neat rows of candles and a few simple lanterns. But when Scrooge stepped inside, he felt as though he had entered a room built for quiet. The air held the faint sweetness of wax and the cleaner, sharper note of tallow. And behind the counter, the chandler stood with sleeves rolled, hands marked by work. He looked up, not startled, only mildly curious, and Scrooge offered a small greeting and asked for 2 beeswax candles of a steady size, the kind meant to burn long rather than flare. The chandler selected them with care, weighing each in his hand as if listening for some hidden flaw, and wrapped them in paper that barely rustled, tying the parcel with twine that lay flat and sure. Watching him, Scrooge felt the same quiet appreciation he had felt at the bakery. The dignity of hands that move without hurry because they know what they are doing. He paid without argument and accepted the parcel, and as he turned to leave, he noticed a small lantern on a shelf, its glass slightly clouded from age. It occurred to him that light was not always a bright thing. Sometimes it was merely a little steadiness against dark. That thought followed him back out into the street, where the fog seemed a shade thicker, as though London were pulling its collar up against the cold. His second stop brought him to a building whose stairwell he had noticed on earlier walks. One of those narrow passages between front door and upper rooms where drafts gathered as though invited. The building was not poor enough to be called desperate, but it bore the quiet wear of people who lived close to the line between comfort and endurance. The stairwell's small window was cracked at a corner, and even from the street, Scrooge could see the way the cold sat there, waiting. He chose his moment carefully, stepping in when the door opened briefly for a tenant and then eased shut again. Inside, the stairwell smelled of damp wool and old wood, and the air moved faintly, restless with chill. He climbed only a few steps, not far enough to intrude, and found a flat ledge beside the banister where a parcel could be set without sliding. He placed 1 beeswax candle there, still wrapped, its paper smooth beneath his palm. It was a small thing, almost absurd in its simplicity, yet he imagined how it might look when found, how a hand might lift it, how a match might strike, how the flame would gather and hold itself steady, turning the draft's sharpness into something softer. He did not linger for the imagining to grow elaborate. He stepped back down and out again, returning to the street with the peculiar sensation that he had adjusted something in the city's balance by a fraction too small to measure. The third stop carried him toward a corner where a watchman often stood, keeping a quiet eye on a stretch of road that never seemed entirely safe from petty trouble. Scrooge had observed him more than once, a man of middle years with shoulders that held themselves as if they had learned not to relax, his breath visible in pale bursts, his hands bare more often than not. Tonight, the watchman stood near a lamp that flickered in the fog, its light making the man's face look both older and more patient. Scrooge did not approach him directly. That would have been an introduction, and introductions invited recognition. Instead, he moved as if merely passing, turning into a small side recess where a stone post jutted from the wall. There, half in shadow, he set down the parcel containing the gloves, placing it close enough to the lamp that it would be noticed, yet far enough from the main path that it would not be claimed by the first hurried passerby. As he straightened, he heard the watchman shift his feet, the subtle scrape of boot on stone. A moment later, in the edge of his vision, the man's head turned slightly, sensing movement. Scrooge kept his face angled away, his posture ordinary, and continued walking with the same unremarkable pace he had maintained all evening. He did not look back. Still, he felt without certainty, without proof that the parcel would be found, that cold hands would soon meet warmed wool, and that the gift would do what it was meant to do, make a small portion of the night easier to endure. The walk home completed the circle with quiet inevitability. The fog thinned as he neared his own street, and the familiar gas lamps seemed less like watchful eyes and more like companions, keeping him from disappearing altogether. When he entered his room, warmth met him with a soft, immediate relief. He hung his coat, unwound his scarf, and set the kettle on as though performing a closing gesture in a ceremony no one else attended. Only then did he open the ledger and find the blank beneath the first night's line. The paper looked calm under lamplight, waiting without impatience. He wrote the date, then paused, listening to the faint tick of cooling metal near the hearth and the distant, muffled life of London beyond his window. At last, he wrote a single sentence, plain, measured, and true to what he had done. Light is kind when it does not demand to be seen. He set the pen down carefully, as if even the ink deserved gentleness, poured his tea, and sat near the fire until the steam softened into air, and the night, somewhere out there, held its quiet warmth a little longer. The following evening arrived with a steadier cold, as if the weather, having tested London once, now felt certain it could press a little harder. Scrooge sensed it before he opened the door, in the way the window panes held a faint, tight sheen, and the air in the room leaned closer to the fire. He had spent the day in quiet preparation, not the feverish industry of his former years, but a gentle arranging of objects and intentions, so that when dusk settled, he would not be tempted into haste. The first night's route had left him oddly calm, as though repetition were a kind of shelter, and he found himself craving that shelter again. The familiar circle of streets, the 3 measured pauses, the return to a room that waited for him without questions. He lit the lamp early, not for brightness, but for steadiness, and set his table as he had done before, clearing away anything that did not belong to the ritual. The ledger remained closed at his elbow, its presence reassuring rather than demanding, and beside it, he placed the items he had chosen: a pair of wool-lined gloves, plain and dark, and 2 beeswax candles wrapped in simple paper, their pale gold color holding a suggestion of summer stored in solid form. Beeswax, he had discovered, possessed a warmth that did not shout. It smelled faintly of honey and clean comb, and when held near a flame, it softened as though it remembered what it had once been. He set the candles on a small dish close to the hearth, not too near to deform them, but near enough that their surface lost the day's chill. The gloves he warmed differently, laying them over the back of a chair by the fire, so that they gathered heat slowly, as a body gathers it after coming in from the street. There was something quietly intimate about warming gloves for someone he would not meet. It felt less like charity and more like common sense, a practical answer to the simple fact that winter required covering. He checked the seams, ran his fingertips along the lining, and felt the soft give of wool that would not scratch. Then he folded them carefully, the way a person folds their own things when they have learned, perhaps late, that care is a form of respect. The wrapping went more quickly than the first night, though he did not allow it to become careless. Paper, cut cleanly, made a sound like restrained snowfall. Twine tightened with a small sigh. He tied ribbon only once, a narrow strip he had found in a drawer, and even then he made the knot plain, a knot meant to hold rather than decorate. When he sealed the final fold, he used a touch of wax, not the wax of his stamp, but a small drop melted from the candle itself pressed to the paper so that it would stay shut without fuss. He liked the thought that the candle contributed to its own containment, as though it agreed to be carried and placed and found. When at last the parcels sat ready, simple and compact, he took a moment to breathe in the room's warmth. The faint scent of tea from the earlier kettle, the iron tang of coal, the quiet perfume of paper. He drew on his coat, wound his scarf, and stepped into the evening with the parcels held close, as if he were protecting something more delicate than wax and wool. London met him with fog that was thinner than the night before, but sharper at the edges. Gas lamps trembled slightly in the damp, their halos smaller, as though even the light had learned to conserve itself. Scrooge walked at his chosen pace, unhurried, attentive, neither skulking nor announcing, allowing the rhythm of his steps to calm the mind's tendency to wander. He passed the bakery as part of his circle, though tonight it was not his first stop, and the familiar warmth behind the glass felt like a nod from an acquaintance. His route, he realized, was becoming a kind of spine for the night, a structure around which small acts could settle without collapsing into sentiment. He wanted, with almost stubborn simplicity, to keep the spine straight. 3 stops, 3 parcels, no names, no credit, a return. It was a discipline, but not a harsh one. It was the discipline of keeping something gentle from being spoiled. The chandler's shop lay along a street that seemed to hold light differently, with narrow windows that threw soft rectangles onto the pavement. From outside, the shop appeared modest, no lavish displays, only neat rows of candles and a few simple lanterns. But when Scrooge stepped inside, he felt as though he had entered a room built for quiet. The air held the faint sweetness of wax and the cleaner, sharper note of tallow. And behind the counter, the chandler stood with sleeves rolled, hands marked by work. He looked up, not startled, only mildly curious, and Scrooge offered a small greeting and asked for 2 beeswax candles of a steady size, the kind meant to burn long rather than flare. The chandler selected them with care, weighing each in his hand as if listening for some hidden flaw, and wrapped them in paper that barely rustled, tying the parcel with twine that lay flat and sure. Watching him, Scrooge felt the same quiet appreciation he had felt at the bakery. The dignity of hands that move without hurry because they know what they are doing. He paid without argument and accepted the parcel, and as he turned to leave, he noticed a small lantern on a shelf, its glass slightly clouded from age. It occurred to him that light was not always a bright thing. Sometimes it was merely a little steadiness against dark. That thought followed him back out into the street, where the fog seemed a shade thicker, as though London were pulling its collar up against the cold. His second stop brought him to a building whose stairwell he had noticed on earlier walks. One of those narrow passages between front door and upper rooms where drafts gathered as though invited. The building was not poor enough to be called desperate, but it bore the quiet wear of people who lived close to the line between comfort and endurance. The stairwell's small window was cracked at a corner, and even from the street, Scrooge could see the way the cold sat there, waiting. He chose his moment carefully, stepping in when the door opened briefly for a tenant and then eased shut again. Inside, the stairwell smelled of damp wool and old wood, and the air moved faintly, restless with chill. He climbed only a few steps, not far enough to intrude, and found a flat ledge beside the banister where a parcel could be set without sliding. He placed 1 beeswax candle there, still wrapped, its paper smooth beneath his palm. It was a small thing, almost absurd in its simplicity, yet he imagined how it might look when found, how a hand might lift it, how a match might strike, how the flame would gather and hold itself steady, turning the draft's sharpness into something softer. He did not linger for the imagining to grow elaborate. He stepped back down and out again, returning to the street with the peculiar sensation that he had adjusted something in the city's balance by a fraction too small to measure. The third stop carried him toward a corner where a watchman often stood, keeping a quiet eye on a stretch of road that never seemed entirely safe from petty trouble. Scrooge had observed him more than once, a man of middle years with shoulders that held themselves as if they had learned not to relax, his breath visible in pale bursts, his hands bare more often than not. Tonight, the watchman stood near a lamp that flickered in the fog, its light making the man's face look both older and more patient. Scrooge did not approach him directly. That would have been an introduction, and introductions invited recognition. Instead, he moved as if merely passing, turning into a small side recess where a stone post jutted from the wall. There, half in shadow, he set down the parcel containing the gloves, placing it close enough to the lamp that it would be noticed, yet far enough from the main path that it would not be claimed by the first hurried passerby. As he straightened, he heard the watchman shift his feet, the subtle scrape of boot on stone. A moment later, in the edge of his vision, the man's head turned slightly, sensing movement. Scrooge kept his face angled away, his posture ordinary, and continued walking with the same unremarkable pace he had maintained all evening. He did not look back. Still, he felt without certainty, without proof that the parcel would be found, that cold hands would soon meet warmed wool, and that the gift would do what it was meant to do, make a small portion of the night easier to endure. The walk home completed the circle with quiet inevitability. The fog thinned as he neared his own street, and the familiar gas lamps seemed less like watchful eyes and more like companions, keeping him from disappearing altogether. When he entered his room, warmth met him with a soft, immediate relief. He hung his coat, unwound his scarf, and set the kettle on as though performing a closing gesture in a ceremony no one else attended. Only then did he open the ledger and find the blank beneath the first night's line. The paper looked calm under lamplight, waiting without impatience. He wrote the date, then paused, listening to the faint tick of cooling metal near the hearth and the distant, muffled life of London beyond his window. At last, he wrote a single sentence plain, measured, and true to what he had done. Light is kind when it does not demand to be seen. He set the pen down carefully, as if even the ink deserved gentleness, poured his tea, and sat near the fire until the steam softened into air, and the night, somewhere out there, held its quiet warmth a little longer. By the third evening, the ritual had begun to settle into Scrooge's body, the way certain habits do when they are repeated with care, as a quiet readiness in the hands, a calmness in the breath, a sense that the night would unfold along a familiar track. The weather had not softened, but it had become predictable in its sternness. The cold lay against the city like a thin sheet of iron, and the damp found every seam in brick and cloth. Yet inside Scrooge's room, the fire held steady, and the simple task of preparation gave him a warmth that had nothing to do with coal. He had spent the day thinking not of people he kept his rule about names, but of needs. There were forms of cold that gloves and candles could ease, and then there was the cold that sat deeper, the cold that came when the stomach was empty and the body's own heat had no fuel. He did not like to imagine hunger, perhaps because it forced him to admit how long he had lived in comfort without noticing the cost of it to others. Still, he had promised himself he would not turn away from what was plain. Tonight, he decided, the parcel would be simple nourishment, something warm enough to reach the hands first, and then the heart. He began early, while the sky outside the curtain still held a faint, reluctant gray. Soup could not be rushed if it were to be kind. He set a pot on the stove and warmed a little butter in the bottom until it gave off that small, soft scent that makes even a bare kitchen feel like home. Into it, he stirred onions cut fine, letting them soften slowly rather than brown. And as they turned translucent, he added carrots, thin rounds that glowed in the firelight like small coins redeemed from a harsher economy. He did not make the soup elaborate. He chose a broth that could be sipped as well as eaten, a warmth that would not demand teeth or strength. A handful of barley went in for steadiness, and a few sprigs of thyme for a clean, mild fragrance. When he poured in water and watched it turn cloudy with promise, he lowered the flame and let the pot settle into a gentle simmer, a sound like quiet breathing. The steam rose steadily, and the room filled with an honest scent. Not perfume, not sweetness, but the plain reassurance of food. While it cooked, he set out the thermos he had purchased that morning. A metal cylinder polished, but not showy, sturdy enough to hold heat through a long night. He rinsed it in hot water first, an old habit from a life of fastidiousness, now redirected toward care, then dried it thoroughly and set it by the hearth where the metal would not be shocked by sudden warmth. The act of preparing a vessel felt almost as important as preparing the soup itself. A thermos could keep heat captive, could carry it like a secret through fog and wind, and Scrooge liked the thought of warmth traveling unseen, arriving intact. He also prepared a second, smaller flask, plain and spare, a precaution that felt necessary in a city where need rarely appeared in single, tidy forms. When the soup was ready, he tasted it and found it gentle in the way he intended. The barley soft, the broth rich enough to comfort, but not heavy. He added salt carefully, a little at a time, until the flavor seemed to sit calmly on the tongue. Then he ladled it into the thermos, watching the steam coil upward as if reluctant to be contained. The metal warmed beneath his fingers, and when he screwed the lid on, he heard the soft final click that signaled the heat had been sealed away. He wrapped the thermos in a cloth to prevent it from burning any hand that found it too quickly, and tied the cloth with twine so it would stay. The smaller flask he filled as well and set beside the first. Tonight's parcels were heavier than candles and gloves. They had a different gravity. Food, he realized, was an intimacy of its own, and he would have to hold his rules firmly to keep that intimacy from turning into intrusion. As dusk gathered, he packed the thermoses into a plain bag, along with a small packet of bread he had bought from the bakery. Nothing fancy, just a loaf cut into thick slices, wrapped in paper that would keep it dry. He did not write a letter this time. The warmth itself seemed enough. Besides, a note might invite a response, and he wanted this gift to ask for nothing at all. He put on his coat, took the bag in his hand, and stepped into the evening. The air outside felt sharper than the nights before, and the fog sat lower, as if trying to hide the city's ankles. Gas lamps trembled, their light dimmed by moisture, and the street stones looked slick, reflecting faint halos like pale coins scattered on the ground. Scrooge walked carefully, not from fear, but from attention. The bag pulled slightly at his arm, reminding him with each step that warmth was being carried. He followed his route without deviation, letting the familiar pattern quiet his mind. He passed the Chandler's Street, where the scent of wax lingered near the shop's door even now, and he passed the stairwell where he had left a candle, wondering briefly whether it had been found. He did not allow the thought to grow. His rules were not meant to harden him, only to keep him from needing proof. If he required proof, he would soon require gratitude, and gratitude would become a currency. He had handled too much currency in his life. He wanted none of it now. The first stop tonight was the back entrance of a place where warm food sometimes gathered one of those modest kitchens run by a parish or a group of women who knew, without dramatics, how many mouths winter could empty. Scrooge had not spoken to them directly before. He approached their door with the kind of caution one uses when entering a room where one does not belong. The lane behind the building was narrow and smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet wood. A small window near the door glowed with interior light, and through it he could hear the clatter of pots and the low murmur of voices. He paused, listening, timing his moment not to interrupt too sharply. When he knocked, he did it quietly, just enough to announce himself without demanding attention. The door opened partway, and a woman looked out, her cheeks flushed from heat, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. Her eyes took him in quickly, an older man with a plain bag and no evident malice. "Yes?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the tired caution of someone who has learned that not every visitor comes to help. Scrooge lifted the bag slightly. "I've brought soup," he said, and felt how strange the words sounded. Simple and domestic on his tongue. "For the night. If it would be acceptable, I can leave it here." He did not add explanations. He had found that explanations often carried self-importance, and he wanted to keep his voice small. The woman's gaze softened by a fraction, the way faces do when they encounter something ordinary enough to trust. She opened the door a little wider and stepped aside, letting him place one thermos on a bench inside the threshold. "We'll make use of it," she said, and then, as if compelled by habit, began to ask a question: who he was, perhaps, or why, before stopping herself. She saw, he thought, the intent in his restraint and respected it. She nodded once, a quiet acceptance. Scrooge returned the nod, turned, and left before the moment could become heavier than it needed to be. Behind him, the door closed gently, and the lane resumed its damp quiet. He felt no triumph, only a small settling in his chest, as if a stone had been placed carefully on a wall that was being rebuilt. His second stop drew him toward the river, where the air always carried a slightly different cold, more open, more raw, as though the water insisted on reminding the city that it could not fully be tamed. The embankment was quieter at this hour, the fog stretching across the surface of the Thames like a pale cloth. A few figures moved in the distance, their outlines softened by mist. Scrooge walked along the stone wall until he reached a bench he had noticed on previous nights, sheltered partially by a post and the angle of a stair leading down. It was a place where someone might sit and not be entirely exposed, and also a place that could be found by those who knew the night's geography. He set the smaller flask there, tucked behind the post so it would not be seen from afar, yet not hidden so deeply it would be missed. Beside it, he placed 2 slices of bread, wrapped to keep them from damp. The act was quiet, almost furtive, but not in a guilty way. It was the furtiveness of protecting something small from being taken by chance rather than by need. As he straightened, he listened. The river made its soft, continuous sound, a dark whisper beneath the city's surface noise. Somewhere nearby, a gull cried once and then fell silent. Scrooge stood for a moment longer than necessary, letting the air settle around him, and felt the peculiar humility of leaving warmth in a place where no one was waiting to receive it. It required a different kind of faith. Not faith in people, exactly, but faith in the night's own capacity to deliver a gift to the right hands. He turned away and continued. The third stop brought him to the familiar lodging house, where the smell of damp cloth and smoke greeted him, even before he reached the door. Tonight he did not slip inside. He had learned from the previous visit that his presence, even quiet, was a disturbance. Instead, he chose the corridor outside an overhang near the side entrance, where men often paused, perhaps to gather courage before stepping into the common room, perhaps to take a breath away from crowded air. Under that overhang was a broad sill beneath a window, and on that sill he placed the remaining bread and a small tin cup he had bought that morning, cheap but clean, so the soup could be poured without requiring someone to have their own vessel. He set the tin cup upside down beside the bread, a simple signal that it was meant to be used, not displayed. Then, with a final glance to ensure the parcels sat steady and would not tip into the wet, he stepped away, letting the shadows reclaim him. The walk home felt slightly longer, perhaps because carrying warmth and leaving it behind makes one aware of the cold one re-enters. His hands were not numb. His gloves were good, his coat thick, but he felt the winter in the bones of the city, the persistent damp that seeped into stone and lingered. Yet he also felt a steadiness in his own chest, the steadying effect of having done what he intended without complication. When he reached his room, the fire had held, as if it had been waiting. He hung his coat, rubbed his hands briefly near the hearth, and set the kettle on. The familiar domestic actions closed the night like a soft cover closing over a book. He opened the ledger and wrote the date with calm precision. The page, already holding 2 lines from 2 nights, looked less empty now, as if the ritual were carving a small path through paper, the way his steps carved a path through the city. He paused before writing, searching for a sentence that would not embellish, would not dramatize. At last he wrote, "Warmth travels best when it is sealed, carried, and left without a sound." The ink dried to a quiet certainty. He set the pen down, poured his tea, and sat near the fire until the last steam rose and vanished, and the night outside, for a little while, seemed less like iron and more like cloth. On the 4th day, after he began his route, Scrooge woke with the peculiar sensation that the city had already started moving without him, as if London were a great machine whose gears never truly paused, only shifted tone from night to morning. The sound that reached him through the window was not loud, an occasional wheel over stone, a distant call, the muffled closing of a door, but it carried the quiet insistence of routine. He sat up slowly, feeling the warmth of the quilt fall away and the cool air settle on his skin, and for a moment he wondered at how much of his old life had been composed of mornings like this, mornings in which he rose not to live, but to pursue. Now, pursuit had been replaced by preparation, and preparation by a kind of calm. The ritual had given his days a gentler spine. Even the cold seemed less hostile when he could anticipate its shape and answer it with small warmth. He spent the morning walking not his route, but a different line through the city, one that led him toward the stalls and small shops where objects lived second lives. The sky held a pale, tired color, and the air smelled of damp wool and coal smoke. Yet there was also, in certain streets, the faint scent of paper and ink that always comforted him more than he would have admitted in earlier years. He had kept ledgers for most of his life. He had known paper as a tool, as a surface for numbers and names. Only lately had he begun to see paper as a vessel for something quieter, thoughts, solace, the weightless company of words. He wanted, for tonight, to leave a book, not a new one, glossy and proud, but an old book, something already softened by hands, something that carried the calm of being used and returned to. At a second-hand stall tucked beneath an awning, he found what he was looking for. The stall-keeper was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a face that looked both sharp and tired, as if he had spent his life peering too closely at small print. Books were stacked in uneven towers, their spines a patchwork of fading titles. Scrooge moved through them slowly, careful not to dislodge anything, and let his fingertips rest on cloth covers and cracked leather. He did not choose by fame or importance. He chose by feel, a book that opened without protest, whose pages were intact, whose type was clear enough to read by poor light. His hand paused on a modest volume of essays, thoughtful, plain, the kind of writing that did not shout for attention but offered steady companionship. When he opened it, the paper breathed up a faint scent of dust and time, not unpleasant, only honest. He turned a few pages, reading a line here and there, and felt that quiet internal click that signaled this was the one. He paid the stall keeper without argument, and as he tucked the book beneath his coat, he felt its solid weight against his ribs, like a small, steady heart. On his way home, he stopped at a stationer's and bought a sheet of stiff paper from which he could make a bookmark. He might have purchased a ready-made one, but there was something in him, some newly gentle impulse that wanted to craft it himself, to make the small object as deliberate as the route. Back in his room, he sat at the table by the fire and cut the paper into a narrow strip, smoothing the edges with care so it would not snag. He took his pen and wrote on it in neat, even letters, not a message that demanded gratitude, but a simple instruction to the mind. Pause here. Then, after a moment, he added beneath it, smaller, breathe, and continue when ready. It was not a flourish. It was, he hoped, a kind of permission. The wrapping that evening was quieter than on previous nights. A book did not need twine pulled tight like a parcel of food, nor wax stamped like a seal of warmth. It needed protection from damp, and it needed to look ordinary enough to be taken without fear. He wrapped it in brown paper, thick enough to keep out moisture, and tied it with a single loop of twine, the knot small and flat. The bookmark he slid inside the front cover, placing it near the middle of the book as though it were already in use, as though the reader might come upon it like a gentle surprise. When he held the wrapped volume in his hands, it felt less like a gift and more like an offering of silence, a small pocket of stillness carried through the city's restless air. Night came early, as it did in winter, and with it the familiar anticipation of the route. Scrooge, dressed without haste, checked that the fire would last until his return, and took the book beneath his arm. Outside, London lay under a low, patient fog that softened the edges of everything. Gas lamps glowed like small moons caught in damp air. He walked his circle at the same steady pace, letting the rhythm of repetition settle his thoughts. He passed places he had already touched with warmth: the bakery, the stairwell, the riverside bench. Each seemed unchanged, and yet he felt as though something in his perception had changed, as though the city's ordinary surfaces now carried invisible threads of gentleness. He did not let himself imagine outcomes. He did not picture the hands that might lift a parcel, the faces that might soften. He held instead to the act itself, the clean simplicity of leaving something useful in the night and then walking away. The first stop was the second-hand bookstall, though tonight he approached it differently, not as a customer, but as a quiet participant in its economy of exchange. The stall was closed now, its awning drawn down, the stacks hidden, yet beside it, under the shelter of the awning's edge, was a narrow crate where the keeper sometimes left unsold pamphlets for passers-by, a small, informal generosity that had likely been there long before Scrooge noticed. Scrooge stepped into the shadow, crouched, and placed his wrapped book inside the crate, beneath a few plain papers, so it would not be obvious from the street. He did not want it taken by the first brisk hand that saw value. He wanted it found by someone who recognized quietness as value. He set it so it would not be crushed, then rose and moved away, letting the stall remain what it was, a place where words waited for new minds. His second stop drew him toward an upstairs door he had noticed near the late-lit window alley, a place that seemed to hold a particular kind of solitude. The window there was not always bright, but it was often lit long after other windows went dark, and Scrooge had begun to associate it with a wakefulness that was not necessarily chosen. Tonight the light was on. The alley held its damp hush, the bricks close on either side, the fog pressing in as if curious. Scrooge stepped lightly, careful of puddles, and found a small recess near the door, an old milk step worn smooth by time. He placed the book there, but not in the open. He tucked it behind a small broken pot that sat abandoned against the wall, sheltering it slightly from rain and from immediate view. The brown paper looked almost like part of the alley's own color, unobtrusive, and for a moment He wondered if the person inside would see it at all. Then, as if the city were answering his doubt with a small sign, he heard the faint creak of floorboards through the door, the gentle movement of someone walking slowly. A cough, subdued, a pause. Scrooge felt a quiet tightening in his throat. Not sorrow exactly, but recognition of how many kinds of wakefulness existed. Wakefulness from worry, from loneliness, from habit. He stepped back into shadow and waited only long enough to ensure he was not directly in the door's line of sight, then moved away without noise. He did not knock. He did not announce. He left the gift to do its work without him. The third stop of the night was the common parlor of a modest building not far from the lodging house, a place where people sometimes gathered not because they loved company, but because their own rooms were too cramped or too cold to hold them comfortably. The parlor was accessible from a side entrance that often stood ajar, and Scrooge had noticed on earlier walks a shelf near the doorway where a few shared objects lived. A cracked teacup, a single candle stub, a battered deck of cards. Tonight, he slipped in quietly. The room dim but not empty. There was the low glow of a lamp, and in a far corner a man sat with his head bowed, perhaps asleep, perhaps simply resting his eyes. Scrooge kept his movements small, his presence as light as possible. He placed a second, smaller book he had brought, a slim volume of poems he had found at home, and wrapped as carefully as the first on the shelf beside the teacup. And inside it, he tucked a second bookmark, blank, but for a single word. Here. He did not linger. He stepped back out and let the door ease shut behind him without a click. Walking home, he felt the familiar settling of completion. The night's gifts had been quieter than soup or scarves. They did not warm the hands directly, but perhaps they warmed something else, something that sat behind the ribs where cold could linger even by a fire. When he reached his room, he performed his closing actions with the same unhurried steadiness. Coat on the hook, hat set aside, kettle on the trivet. The fire murmured. The lamp gave a patient glow. Only then did he open the ledger and write the date. He paused a moment, listening to the faint hiss of the kettle as it began to warm, and then wrote a line that felt plain and true. Some warmth is made of words, and some of silence between them. He closed the book gently, poured his tea, and sat near the hearth until the steam rose and dissolved, as if the room itself were learning how to breathe more slowly. By the fifth evening, Scrooge no longer had to persuade himself to begin. The ritual had become, if not effortless, then at least familiar in the way a well-worn path is familiar. It asked only that he set his feet upon it and keep walking. He found that the day itself arranged around the night's small purpose. His meals were simpler, his hours quieter, his thoughts less inclined to wander into old calculations. Even his body seemed to understand that dusk meant preparation, that the room would be warmed, the table cleared, the fire tended until it held a steady bed of coals. Outside, London remained London fog, damp, the persistent grit of winter. Yet inside his narrow rooms, there was a growing sense of order that did not feel like control so much as care. It pleased him, in a restrained way, to know that something in his life now had a beginning and an ending that were not dictated by profit. This night's parcels would not be food or light or words. He had begun to see that winter's hardness did not always arrive in dramatic forms. Sometimes it came as a fraying cuff, a torn seam, a missing button that let cold slip in through a gap no one else could see. He had watched, on earlier walks, how people held their coats closed with fingers stiff from damp, how a woman pinned a shawl at her throat with a bent piece of metal, how a boy's sleeve hung open at the elbow where thread had given up. Repairs were small acts of endurance, and the ability to repair quietly, steadily, was its own kind of dignity. Scrooge had once admired only things that appeared whole and new. Now he found himself drawn to the gentle skill of mending, to the humble insistence that something torn could be made useful again. He set out the sewing kit components on his table as carefully as he had set out biscuits and candles. There was a small tin box, plain and sturdy, with a lid that closed tightly enough to keep damp out. Inside, he placed needles of different sizes, aligned in a narrow felt strip so they would not scatter. He wound thread onto small cards, black, brown, gray, and one soft cream, choosing colors that would serve common cloth rather than showy garments. He added a thimble, not shiny, just functional, and a few spare buttons in muted tones. Then, as if completing a thought, he placed a small lump of tailor's chalk in the tin, wrapped in paper so it would not crumble into dust. The sound of these objects was quiet but satisfying. The faint tap of metal against metal, the soft scrape of chalk, the small, definite click when the lid met its rim. He counted the buttons twice, not from miserliness, but from the calm reassurance of completeness. It mattered to him now that a gift be reliable, that it not fail the moment it was needed. When the tin was ready, he considered whether to add a letter. A note might explain how to use the kit, might offer encouragement, might turn the parcel into something gentler. Yet he could hear, in his own mind, the way a letter might also become a tether, an invitation to think of the giver rather than the work. A sewing kit spoke in its own language, practical, silent, respectful. He decided to let it remain so. He wrapped the tin in thick paper, folded the corners neatly, and tied it with twine that lay flat across the lid. At the knot, he pressed a small drop of wax, not as a flourish, but as a kind of punctuation, the quiet mark of a finished preparation. The parcel felt modest in his hands, but it had a pleasing weight, the weight of usefulness. He slipped it into his bag, along with a smaller bundle of thread cards, a spare offering that could be left in a shared place. Then he dressed, checked the fire once, and stepped out into the evening. London's night air met him with damp that clung lightly to his coat, and fog that seemed to drift without intention, settling where it pleased. Gas lamps glowed softly, their light less bright than it was patient, and the street stones reflected it in uneven patches like dull silver. Scrooge walked his route as he always did, letting the familiar turns guide him without thought. There was comfort in knowing where he would place his feet, in passing the bakery and the Chandler Street, and the alley of the late-lit window, as if these were beads on a string he could count by touch. He did not hurry, even when a sharper gust of cold found its way under his collar. He had learned that haste made the night feel harsher. He preferred to move as if he belonged to the city's slow winter rhythm, not as if he were fighting it. The first stop tonight was a notions shop, one of those narrow places where thread and ribbon and buttons lived behind glass, and where the air always seemed to smell faintly of starch and cloth. The shop's interior was warm, not from a large fire, but from the accumulation of small things kept dry and close together. Shelves held boxes of pins, spools of thread, folded lengths of fabric, and jars of buttons that looked like captured pebbles. A bell sounded softly as Scrooge entered, and a woman behind the counter looked up with the steady gaze of someone who had spent her life measuring. There was no fuss in her manner, only attention. Scrooge asked for a selection of sturdy thread, a few packets of needles, and tailor's chalk of a plain kind. He did not ask for silk or for anything decorative. The woman moved with practiced calm, retrieving items, laying them on the counter, cutting a length of twine without waste. As she measured, her fingers moved with a quiet confidence that reminded Scrooge of the baker's hands and the chandler's. Competence made gentle by repetition. He watched without staring, noticing how she smoothed a ribbon before setting it down, how she tapped a box to settle its contents. When she wrapped his purchases, the paper made a soft, controlled rustle, and the twine tightened with a small, sure pull. He paid, thanked her briefly, and left with the additional bundle tucked into his bag, feeling as though he had participated, however slightly, in a world where value was counted not in coins alone, but in usefulness. From there, he followed his route toward a doorway he had marked in his mind, but refused to mark in the ledger with anything too precise. He had seen, more than once, a man, perhaps a tailor, perhaps simply someone who repaired cloth for others, step out onto that threshold late in the day, with a bundle under his arm and a tired carefulness in his posture. Scrooge did not want the man's name. He did not want a story. He wanted only to answer the visible need. Hands that worked with thread should not be forced to work without it. The street was quiet when he arrived. Fog softened the building fronts, and the gas lamp nearest the door flickered as if uncertain. Scrooge slowed, listening for movement inside. There was none he could hear, and that, too, felt right. A gift left too directly could embarrass. He preferred the small safety of anonymity. He set the parcel on the step beside the door, not centered where it would announce itself, but tucked slightly to one side where it would still be found. He placed it so the waxed knot faced upward, as if presenting the simplest part of the work first. Then he stepped back, letting the shadow of a nearby wall take him in. For a moment, he stood there, feeling the weight of the night press gently at his shoulders, and he thought about how many thresholds in his old life had been places where he demanded entry into accounts, into agreements, into other people's circumstances. Tonight, the threshold was something else entirely, a place where he left without taking. The thought steadied him, and he turned away before the act could become sentimental. His third stop brought him toward a mending corner he had noticed near the lodging house. A small lamplit space in a side room where scraps of cloth were sometimes piled, and where someone, on earlier nights, had been quietly stitching by the glow of a single lamp. It was not a formal workshop, only a makeshift place where repairs happened because they had to. Scrooge approached carefully, keeping his steps light, and found that the door to the side room was ajar just enough to spill a thin line of light onto the corridor. He did not enter fully. He did not wish to startle anyone or draw attention to himself. Instead, he paused at the threshold, and in the brief glance he allowed himself, he saw a table, a lamp, and the suggestion of hands moving slowly over fabric. Someone was there, intent, bowed over work that required patience. Scrooge placed the smaller bundle thread cards and an extra packet of needles on a shelf just inside the doorway, where it could be found without anyone having to speak to him. The paper made almost no sound as he set it down. He did not linger to watch. He withdrew as quietly as he had come, letting the thin line of lamplight remain undisturbed. As he stepped back into the corridor's shadow, he felt again that familiar pull to do more, to press coins into the bundle, to leave a longer note, to make sure the gift reached precisely the person he had imagined. He resisted. Precision, he reminded himself, was part of his old self's hunger for control. The new ritual was built on trust. Trust that warmth, left gently, would find its place. The walk home completed the circle with a calm inevitability. The fog had thickened slightly, making the lamp's halos wider and softer, and the city's sounds seemed more distant, as though London were wrapped in its own scarf. When Scrooge reached his door, he felt the small relief of returning to warmth, the quiet satisfaction of ending a night as he had begun it. Deliberately, inside, he hung his coat, set his hat aside, and put the kettle on, listening for the first faint murmur of heating water. Only then did he open the ledger. The page held the accumulating lines of previous nights, each sentence plain, each one a marker of restraint. He wrote the date, then paused, the pen hovering as if waiting for his mind to settle into the right words. He wrote at last, without flourish. Dignity returns in small repairs when the tools to mend are close at hand. The ink dried dark and steady on the page. He closed the ledger softly, poured his tea, and sat near the fire until the steam thinned and vanished, and the room's warmth gathered around him like a quiet agreement that the night had been used well. The sixth evening arrived with a kind of weariness in the air, not dramatic, only persistent, as though the city had carried the same damp coat for too many days and could not quite shake it dry. Scrooge felt it in the way his joints resisted the cold when he rose from his chair, in the way the window glass held a faint, dull sheen even after he wiped it, and in the way London's sounds seemed slightly softened, as if the fog had begun to muffle not only footsteps but spirits. He had kept his route faithfully, 3 stops, a fixed circle, the quiet return, and yet he understood that warmth was not always a matter of cloth or food. There were nights, he had noticed, when people looked less hungry than exhausted, less cold than strained, as if the chill had found its way into the mind and settled there. He could not mend everything. He did not try. But he had begun to think about sleep, about the plain mercy of rest, and about how easily rest can be stolen by a room too crowded, a corridor too loud, a body too tense from enduring one small hardship after another. That morning, he had passed an apothecary and caught, in the brief open and close of its door, a faint trace of lavender clean, pale, almost shy. It had reminded him of something he had forgotten. That calm has a scent, and that scent can act like a door gently closing between a person and their worries. Lavender, if kept light, did not feel like indulgence. It felt like permission. Yet he was careful. Too strong a fragrance might overwhelm, might draw attention, might even irritate those already raw with winter's damp. He wanted only the slightest presence, a whisper rather than a declaration, something that could sit on a cloth or in a corner of a room and gently suggest that the night was safe enough to release its grip. When dusk thickened, he lit his lamp early and set his table as he always did, clearing space until only the evening's work remained. The ledger stayed closed beside his elbow, its leather cover warmed by the hearth's steady breath. On the table, he placed a small glass bottle, clear, simple, with a narrow neck, and beside it, a piece of cork cut to fit. He had also laid out a strip of clean cloth and a handful of dried lavender buds. Not many, just enough to scent a sachet without making it cloying. The room smelled of coal and tea, familiar and grounding, and when he opened the small vial of lavender oil, the new scent rose immediately, delicate, cool, like linen dried in winter sun. He held it a moment near the firelight and found relief in its restraint. He wanted that restraint to remain. He worked slowly, with the same care he gave to wrapping paper and twine. A single drop fell into the bottle, then another, then a third, and he stopped. He added a little neutral oil to soften it further, so that the lavender would not strike first, but arrive gently, almost afterthought. He swirled the bottle once, watched the liquids fold into each other without haste, and then set the cork in place with a soft, final pressure. For the sachet, he gathered the dried buds into the cloth, pulled the corners together, and tied them with thread so fine it barely showed. When he held the sachet near his face, the scent was faint enough that he had to breathe in deliberately to catch it. That pleased him. The point was not to announce comfort, but to offer it quietly, as one offers a chair to a tired guest without drawing attention to their fatigue. Wrapping was simple. He cushioned the bottle in tissue paper that made a gentle, almost inaudible crackle, then placed it in a small paper box and tied it with twine. The sachet he wrapped separately, so it could be used alone or together with the oil. He did not write a letter. A note about sleep could feel too intimate, too knowing. He did not want to suggest that he understood anyone's private battles. His gifts were meant to be practical and quiet, and the privacy of the receivers was part of that practicality. When everything was ready, he placed the parcels in his bag and stood a moment by the fire as if to let its warmth settle into his coat. Then he dressed and stepped out into the night. London met him with a fog that sat low and even, neither thick nor thin, but steady, like a soft veil that had decided to stay. The gas lamps made round halos that trembled slightly, and the damp turned the street stones dark and reflective. Scrooge walked his familiar circle with the same unhurried pace, feeling the reassuring certainty of repetition. He passed the bakery, now a gentle glow behind its curtains. He passed the stairwell where a candle might have burned. He passed the alley of the late-lit window, and though he did not stop, he noticed the window was dark tonight, the rectangle of brightness absent. The absence did not frighten him. It merely reminded him that lives shift, that patterns change, that the route was his, not theirs, and that his task was to offer warmth, whether it was immediately seen or not. The first stop was the apothecary. Its front window held neat rows of bottles that caught the lamplight and turned it into pale glimmers. When Scrooge stepped inside, he entered a world of careful order. Shelves of jars, drawers labeled in a tidy hand, the air scented with dried herbs and clean spirits. An older man stood behind the counter, his hair thinning, his posture calm. He looked up with the mild attention of someone accustomed to quiet requests. Scrooge asked for the smallest bottle of lavender oil, the lightest formulation, and the apothecary nodded as if he understood exactly the kind of gentleness being sought. He measured without haste, poured with steady hands, and handed the bottle over wrapped in tissue with a thin paper sleeve. The tissue made the softest sound, and Scrooge found himself soothed by it, by the very idea that care could be made audible in such small ways. He paid and left, keeping the bottle close in his bag so it would not be chilled by the night. His second stop took him toward a boarding house whose entrance he had noted during earlier walks, not because it was particularly poor or particularly grand, but because it carried a quiet heaviness. People came and went there with shoulders slightly rounded, as though the building's air pressed down. Perhaps it was simply the winter. Perhaps it was the closeness of many lives arranged too tightly together. He did not need to know. He only needed to place something small where it could be found without fuss. The front hall was narrow, its light dim, and the door's latch sat loosely enough that it could open with a gentle push. He waited until the street was empty, then slipped inside, moving as quietly as he could. The hall smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool, and somewhere above, floorboards creaked as someone shifted in their room. There was a small table near the staircase, meant perhaps for letters, though it held only a cracked dish and a few stray buttons. Scrooge set the sachet there, placing it beside the dish as if it had always belonged. Next to it, he placed the small box containing the oil, tucked slightly behind the dish so it would not fall if someone brushed past in haste. He did not linger. A boarding house was too intimate a place for lingering. He stepped back out the way he had come, letting the door ease shut behind him with a sound no louder than breath. As he returned to the street, the fog met him again like a shawl, and he felt a quiet relief that the gift had been left without disturbance, without turning anyone into a spectator. The third stop led him toward the lodging house district, but not into the common room this time. He had noticed, on the edge of his route, a shared washroom used by several tenants of a cramped building, a place where water was carried, where hands were scrubbed, where small, private moments occurred under the indifferent gaze of a single lamp. Such places, he suspected, held a particular kind of exhaustion. One does not wash in a shared room without feeling, at times, the thinness of one's own privacy, yet they also held, in their plainness, the possibility of small mercy. A scent left there could offer a brief easing, a moment of calm while water warmed or while cloth was wrung out. He approached carefully. The washroom door, as he expected, was not locked. It stood slightly ajar, letting out a faint warmth and the smell of soap. Inside, the light was low, and the room was empty at the moment, the basin still. A shelf ran along one wall, holding a few shared items: a chipped mug, a bar of soap wrapped in cloth, an old brush. Scrooge placed a second sachet, one he had prepared as an extra, on that shelf, setting it near the soap where it would be found naturally. He did not leave the oil here. A bottle might be taken too quickly, might become someone's property, might invite argument. The sachet, however, was small and communal by nature. It could scent the room without belonging to anyone. He set it down and withdrew, letting the door remain as it was, a quiet opening in the night. The walk home felt especially gentle after that, as though the lavender scent had lingered faintly on his fingers and softened the air around him. He did not romanticize the feeling. He knew that scent could not fix a life, yet he also knew that small mercies, repeated, could change the texture of a day. When he reached his rooms, he hung his coat, set his hat aside, and placed the kettle on the trivet with the steady competence of habit. The fire had held while he was gone, coals glowing like patient eyes. He sat for a moment before opening the ledger, letting the room's warmth reach him through his sleeves. When he finally turned the brown leather cover back and found the waiting page, he wrote the date with calm precision. The lines of previous nights sat above it, plain and unembellished, and he felt a quiet satisfaction that each entry was a marker of restraint rather than pride. He paused, listening to the kettle's first faint murmur, then wrote a single sentence. Some comfort should arrive, like a whisper enough to ease the breath, not enough to call attention. He set the pen down carefully, poured his tea, and sat by the fire until the steam rose and vanished, and the night outside, still damp, still cold, seemed, in some small corner, a little more breathable. The seventh day carried a different sort of cold into Scrooge's rooms, not sharper in temperature, but heavier in feeling, as though the damp had learned to settle into corners and stay. He noticed it in small ways: the way his coat felt slower to dry on its peg, the way the kettle seemed to take longer to come to its patient murmur, the way even the fire's warmth, though steady, did not quite reach the edges of the room without encouragement. He fed the coals carefully and watched the flame gather itself again, and while he did so, he thought about comfort that was not simply warmth against skin. He had given food that quieted hunger, candles that held back darkness, thread that promised repair, and scent that suggested rest. Yet, there remained another kind of discomfort he had begun to recognize on his route, one that did not always announce itself in torn cuffs or bare hands. It was the discomfort of never being able to sit down without bracing oneself, of perching on hard wood in narrow corridors, of sleeping in rooms where voices seeped through thin walls and the night offered no true privacy. It was the fatigue of constant interruption. He did not indulge in imagining particular lives, but he had eyes, and he had noticed how often the city required people to wait outside offices, in stairwells, on landings, near doors that were not quite theirs. Waiting always looked the same in winter. Shoulders rounded, breath held, hands tucked away, the body trying to make itself smaller against cold and against being seen. On one such landing, he had noticed a chair pushed against the wall, its seat polished by use, its wood too hard for the length of time people seemed to occupy it. It had been, perhaps, an afterthought placed there by someone who did not want tenants leaning against paint. It was still a chair, but it offered little kindness. The thought stayed with him through the day, and by afternoon, it had settled into a plan that felt both modest and oddly urgent. A cushion for that chair, and if he could manage it without breaking his own rules, one quiet night paid for someone who needed a room that held silence like a blanket. He began his preparations earlier than usual. The cushion required making, or at least finishing, and he refused to treat it as a hurried object. He cleared his table, as he always did, creating a clean space where intention could be laid out plainly. On one side, He placed a folded piece of sturdy fabric, plain but soft to the hand, the color of warm earth. He had bought it that morning from an upholsterer's nook not far from his route, a place thick with the smell of cloth and horsehair and old wood, where men spoke little and measured carefully. Beside the fabric, he set a parcel of stuffing, clean, springy, and enclosed in a sack that made a quiet rasp when he moved it. He had also brought home a length of ribbon strong enough to tie the cushion in place and a needle thick enough to bite through upholstery cloth without complaint. There was, too, an envelope lying near the ledger, unmarked, its flap pressed flat, as if it were waiting to become part of the night's work. He worked by the firelight, which gave the fabric a deeper color and made the dust motes drift like slow snow. The cushion itself was simple, a rectangle meant to sit neatly on the chair without slipping. He cut the cloth with measured care, folded the edges inward, and stitched along the seam with steady hands that were learning. Late, the calm of making rather than counting. The needle pulled thread through resistance with a soft, repetitive sound, and as the seam lengthened, Scrooge felt a strange, quiet satisfaction, less the satisfaction of accomplishment than the satisfaction of doing something that required patience. When the cover was nearly complete, he packed it with stuffing, pressing it into corners, distributing it evenly so there would be no lumps that might irritate, no thin spots that would give up warmth too quickly. Then he closed the final seam, tightened the thread, and tied it off with a small knot, tucking the end away so it would not scratch anyone's hand. He smoothed the cushion once, twice, and felt it yield under his palm like a promise. Only after the cushion was finished did he turn his attention to the envelope. This was, he knew, the more delicate part of the evening, not because it involved more money than a tin of biscuits, but because money was the language he had spoken too fluently for too long. He did not want it to reclaim him. He took out a few notes, counted them once, then again, not from greed, but from a desire to be precise without spectacle. He chose an amount that would cover one night's room in a modest place, enough to buy a closed door and a bed and a few hours in which the mind could lower its guard. He did not write a letter of explanation. He did not address it to anyone in particular. He wrote only on the front, in his neat hand, for one quiet night. Then, after a pause, he added beneath it, "No questions asked." He sealed the envelope, not with wax this time, but with the firm press of the flap, and the simplicity of that closure felt important, as though he were refusing ornament even in this. When dusk settled, he wrapped the cushion in paper, not tightly, for paper could crease the fabric, but securely enough to keep damp from it during the walk. He tied it with the ribbon he had chosen, leaving the ends long so it could later be secured to the chair. The envelope he slipped into his inner pocket, close to his chest where it would stay warm and flat. Then he dressed, checked the fire, and stepped out into London's evening. The fog was thinner tonight, but the air carried a cold that seemed to slip through wool as if searching for skin. Gas lamps along the street trembled in small halos, and the stones underfoot held a slick sheen that caught the light in dull glints. Scrooge's bag felt heavier with the cushion than it had with books or candles, and he adjusted his grip, letting the weight remind him to move carefully. He followed his route with the same steady pace as always, not because he feared being seen, but because he wanted the night to remain quiet. There was a calm in the repetition, the familiar turn by the bakery's shuttered front, the narrow passage where fog collected, the broader street where the lamps stood like patient sentries. He passed the alley of the late-lit window. Tonight, the window glowed faintly again, though he did not stop. He held to his 3 stops, and to the discipline that kept his giving from becoming wandering. The first stop was the upholsterer's nook, though, by night, it was closed and dark, its window reflecting only the street's dim lamp. Still, Scrooge paused there as part of his ritual, not to enter, but to acknowledge the beginning of the evening's work. In the daylight, he had stood inside that shop while the upholsterer pulled fabric from a roll, letting it fall in a heavy, soft drape, the sound of it a kind of hush. The man had tested the cloth between rough fingers, nodding once as if approving its sturdiness, and Scrooge had chosen a fabric that would not wear thin quickly, that would not show dirt too readily, that would feel warm even when the room around it was cold. Remembering that careful selection now, he felt a quiet gratitude for trades that understood comfort, not as luxury, but as function. He moved on, letting the shop remain dark and private, its contribution already carried in his bag. The second stop brought him to the corridor chair he had noticed. It stood on a landing in a building whose hallways smelled faintly of soap and damp wool, whose stairwell seemed always to hold a draft. Scrooge waited until the hallway was empty, listening for footsteps above and below, and when the moment came, he slipped inside with the quiet competence of someone who had learned how to move without disturbance. The chair sat exactly where he remembered, pressed against the wall beneath a window that never quite sealed. Its wood was worn smooth at the edges, the seat slightly polished by countless bodies that had perched there while waiting for doors to open, for tempers to cool, for the night to pass. Scrooge set his bag down gently and unwrapped the cushion with care, folding the paper so it would not make an unnecessary sound. Then he placed the cushion on the chair, smoothing it once, and tied the long ribbon ends beneath the seat so it would not slide away at the first shift of weight. For a moment, he stood back and looked at it. The cushion did not transform the landing into warmth and cheer. It could not change the draft or the damp smell of the corridor, yet it softened what could be softened, and perhaps that was enough. A small, yielding beneath tired bones, a place to sit that did not punish. He felt, unexpectedly, a tightness behind his eyes, not tears, not quite, but the sensation of something long held, loosening slightly. He turned away before the feeling could grow sentimental and left the building as quietly as he had entered, closing the door with a restraint that bordered on tenderness. The third stop was more difficult, not in distance, but in intention. Scrooge followed his route toward a modest lodging house, whose keeper, he had learned through observation, handled payments with little ceremony and asked few questions. It was the sort of place where a person could disappear for a night without being interrogated, where silence was not judged as rudeness, but accepted as necessity. Scrooge approached the front desk with his collar turned up and his hat brim low, and he waited until the common room's small bustle quieted enough that his presence would not attract attention. The keeper looked up, eyes tired but alert, and Scrooge spoke softly. "I'd like to pay for a room," he said, and slid the envelope across the desk. "For one night, for whoever asks, no name given." He kept his voice even, not pleading, not commanding. The keeper hesitated only a fraction, glancing at the envelope, then at Scrooge's face, and then away again, as if deciding what kind of man stood before him. Something in Scrooge's posture, his refusal to explain, his calm insistence on anonymity, seemed to satisfy whatever judgment the keeper made. He nodded once, took the envelope, and tucked it beneath the ledger on his side of the desk with the same quiet competence Scrooge had seen in other workers of the city. No questions were asked, no gratitude offered. The transaction was stripped of spectacle, and that, to Scrooge, felt like mercy on both sides. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement and stepped back into the night. The walk home was slower than usual, not because he was weary, but because his mind felt unusually still, as if the act of paying for silence had quieted something inside him as well. The fog had begun to thicken again, and the lamp's halos grew wider, softer, making the streets look gentler than they truly were. When he reached his rooms, the fire greeted him with a low, steady glow. He hung his coat, unwound his scarf, and set the kettle on the trivet, listening for its first faint stir. Only then did he open the ledger and write the date The page was filling now with plain sentences, markers of nights repeated, warmth left and not retrieved. He paused, pen poised, and searched for words that would keep to the truth without ornament. At last he wrote, "Comfort is sometimes nothing more than a place to sit, and a door that closes on noise." He set down the pen, poured his tea, and sat near the hearth until the steam rose and dissolved. And the night beyond the window, still cold, still damp felt, in some small corner of the city, a little less relentless. By the 8th evening, Scrooge had begun to understand that repetition, when chosen freely, does not trap a person, it steadies them. The route no longer felt like a penance he endured, but like a quiet promise. He kept 3 stops, the same circle through familiar streets, the same return to firelight, and a page waiting beneath the lamp. And yet he also sensed, with the careful awareness of someone learning to live without armor, that there are kinds of warmth that do not remain in one place. Some warmth must move, some comfort cannot be wrapped in paper and left on a sill. It must be carried away in a pocket, held close through the cold, and taken to wherever a person's heart insists they belong. He had noticed it in the way certain faces softened when they heard, by chance, a passing mention of a far neighborhood, in the way a hand would pause over a posted notice, as if the paper itself might open into a doorway. He had noticed it in the quiet restlessness of those who seemed not entirely present where they stood, as though part of them remained elsewhere. Scrooge did not build stories around such things. He had trained himself not to. But he could not help acknowledging the simple fact that a city, for all its crowds, can make a person lonelier than an empty field, and that sometimes the surest kindness is to help someone leave, even if only for a little while. He began his preparation in the late afternoon, while the winter light still existed in thin bands along the edges of the curtains. He spread a map across his table, smoothing it with the flat of his hands until the creases gave up their stiffness. The paper smelled faintly of ink and dust, and the lines of streets and rails made a tidy geometry that pleased him in a quiet way. Beside the map, he placed a timetable he had purchased that morning, the kind printed on cheap paper, folded into quarters, the ink already smudging at the edges from too many hands. He studied it without hurry, tracing the routes outward from London like veins leading to warmer places, to smaller towns, to edges where the city's constant noise might thin into something gentler. He did not search for a dramatic destination. He chose instead a line that was common enough to be unremarkable and direct enough to be used without complication. He wanted a ticket that could be understood quickly, accepted easily, and held without fear of misunderstanding. When he found the right departure and return, he marked the time quietly in his mind and folded the timetable again with care, as if the act of folding sealed his intention. The envelope came next. He selected one of sturdy paper, neither fine nor flimsy, and with his pen he wrote only a date, tomorrow's date, followed by a single time. He did not add a name. He did not add an explanation. He did not write home, because the word itself can feel like a hand reaching too close to a person's private longing. Yet, he chose the date and time with deliberation, because leaving requires courage, and courage is easier to find when the details are already arranged. He set the envelope aside, still empty, as if it were waiting to be filled with a small permission. Then he dressed, not yet for the street, but as if for steady work. Sleeves rolled slightly, coat kept near the fire so it would not feel sharp when he put it on. The room was warm enough that he could take his time. He poured himself a small cup of tea, not as a comfort, but as a way of settling his breath. And as the steam rose, he felt a strange mix of emotions, quiet, resolve, cautious tenderness, and the faint ache of remembering how long he had believed money was meant only to bind, never to release. When dusk deepened into night, he took the envelope and slipped it into his inner pocket, close to his chest. He checked the map once more, not because he doubted the direction, but because the act of checking felt like part of the ritual, attention given before action. Then he put on his coat, wound his scarf, and stepped out, letting the door close behind him with a soft finality. London received him in damp air and wavering gaslight. The fog was present, as it had been most nights, but it had thinned enough to reveal the hard outlines of buildings and the darker, wetter sheen of stones underfoot. His breath rose in pale wisps, and the city's sounds seemed slightly sharper tonight. Carriage wheels, a distant shout, the occasional clatter of a closing shutter, as if the air carried sound more easily when the fog was less thick. He walked his familiar circle, letting the route guide him toward the first stop, the station. The station at night held its own particular kind of hush, not quiet in the sense of silence, but quiet in the sense of contained motion. Even when not crowded, it felt full of intention, footsteps that meant somewhere, voices that spoke in brief, practical phrases, the faint, metallic rhythm of distant work. The ticket booth's glass reflected gaslight in soft smears, and behind it, a clerk sat with shoulders slightly hunched, his face lit from below by a small lamp that made his eyes look tired. Scrooge approached with the calm steadiness he had practiced on his route, and when the clerk looked up, he spoke plainly, naming the destination and the time without elaboration. The clerk's fingers moved with practiced indifference, the kind that is not unkind but efficient, and the ticket emerged a small rectangle of stiff paper, printed, stamped, and slid beneath the glass with a soft scrape. Scrooge paid and took the ticket, and for a moment he held it between gloved fingers, feeling its dryness, its lightness, the way something so small could contain so much movement. He did not linger. Stations invite lingering, and lingering invites thoughts to swell. He tucked the ticket into his pocket and stepped back into the street, returning to the night's colder air with the sense that he carried not a parcel, but a hinge, something that could open. His second stop lay along the route where the city grew quieter, where the street lamps stood farther apart and the houses held themselves close as if protecting what little warmth they had. He had chosen a modest door, one he had seen often enough to recognize without knowing anything beyond it. A door whose paint was worn at the handle, whose step bore the smoothness of many comings and goings, whose window, when it showed light at all, showed it late. He did not know who lived there, nor did he want to. He knew only that the door belonged to someone who moved through the night with a careful, tired rhythm, someone who paused often at the corner as if deciding whether to continue. Scrooge approached without hurry, and, as he had done at other thresholds, he chose a place that would protect the envelope from damp and from immediate notice. There was a small gap beneath a flower pot on the step, sheltered by the pot's lip. He slid the envelope there so that the written date and time remained visible, but nothing else. Then he stepped back into shadow, letting the wall's darkness take him in. From inside the house came no immediate sound, and he did not wait for one. Waiting would have turned the act into a performance, and he had promised himself again and again that his gifts were not meant to purchase reactions. Yet as he turned away, he heard, faintly, a shifting of footsteps above, the soft creak of floorboards, the nearly inaudible sound of someone moving in a room where silence had become habit. The sound tightened something in his chest, not sorrow, not pity, but a plain recognition of private endurance. He continued walking, leaving the envelope behind like a quiet door key, and he resisted the urge to look back, reminding himself that this was the only way he could keep the gift clean of his presence. The third stop was not a place where he left an object. It was, instead, a place where he practiced restraint. At a lamplit corner, not far from the lodging house district, he paused as he always did, not because the route required it, but because his body had learned that this corner was where the night's work could be measured. The lamp above trembled faintly in the damp air, its light falling onto the stones in a soft circle. From here, he could see 2 streets branching away, each disappearing into a different thickness of fog, and he could hear the city's distant murmurs like water behind a wall. He stood there longer than usual, letting his breath slow, letting the cold settle without fighting it. He thought, carefully and without dramatics, about leaving, about how difficult it can be to step away from what is familiar, even when what is familiar is harsh. He thought about how the smallest assistance, one ticket, one printed time, could shift a person's possibilities from endurance to motion. The thought made him unusually still. In the lamplight, he felt, for a moment, both very old and very new, a man who had once bound others with debt, now learning how to loosen a knot without boasting about it. When he reached home, the warmth of his room met him with the same quiet tenderness it always did. He hung his coat, unwound his scarf, and set the kettle on the trivet as if closing a book with care. The fire had held, coals glowing softly, and he stood a moment near the hearth to let the heat reach his hands. Then he opened the ledger. The entries of previous nights had begun to create a kind of rhythm on the page dates, plain sentences, small truths stated without ornament. He wrote tonight's date, paused, and then wrote with steady clarity. Leaving can be a quiet kind of healing when the door opens without drama. He set down the pen, poured his tea, and sat by the fire until the steam thinned into the air, allowing the night beyond the glass to remain what it was: cold, damp, and vast, while trusting that somewhere along his route a small rectangle of paper might be found and held, and that holding it might be enough to begin. The 9th evening came with a clear cold that made the fog retreat, as though even mist had grown tired of lingering. London's outlines sharpened in the cleaner air. Brick edges looked harder, windows brighter, and the gas lamp's halos tightened into smaller circles of light. Scrooge noticed the change at once, not only in the street's appearance, but in his own senses. Sound carried farther when the air was clear. He could hear a carriage wheel on distant stone and a faint shout from a side street, and these ordinary noises, so often muffled by damp, seemed suddenly more present, as if the city were speaking a little louder. Yet inside his room, the familiar warmth held steady, and in that steadiness, he felt the gentle counterweight to London's restless breath. The route had become his quiet answer to the city's sharpness, not resistance, but a softening gesture repeated until it felt like habit. Tonight's parcel would be almost weightless. He had given food and light, thread and scent, even the possibility of travel, and each gift had been practical. Yet he had begun to sense that practicality alone does not always reach the place where a person's coldest thoughts settle. There were wounds that did not show in fabric, and repairs that could not be made with needle and thread. Words, simple, honest words, might be another form of warmth, especially when they arrived without expectation. He had been thinking, in the quiet hours between one route and the next, about gratitude and about how rarely it is offered without being tangled in obligation. Gratitude, when delayed, can feel awkward, as if the moment has passed and the chance to speak kindly has expired. In his old life, Scrooge had used gratitude as a currency, accepting it when it served him and ignoring it when it did not. He had rarely given it. There were people he could admit this now without flinching, who had deserved thanks from him long ago and never received it, not only for kindness, but for endurance, for patience, for being present in a world where he had made himself difficult to approach. He could not go back and correct every failure, but he could learn, at least, to place gratitude into the world without asking it to return. He began early, while the fire still burned high from the fresh coal he had laid. He cleared the table with his usual quiet precision, placing the ledger to one side, its brown leather cover warm to the touch, and set out paper and envelope, both plain but of good quality. The pen lay beside them, cleaned and filled, as if ready for something more careful than mere record-keeping. He sat and rested his hands on the table for a moment, letting his breath settle. Writing, he found, demanded a different kind of honesty than buying or wrapping. You could choose a tin of biscuits without facing much of yourself. A sentence, however, had to pass through the mind's private rooms. It could not be made convincingly without feeling. He did not write a letter to any particular person because that would have required names, addresses, and a directness that might disturb more than it soothed. Instead, he chose to write a thank you letter meant to be found by someone who needed it, someone who might read it and feel, if only briefly, that their effort in the world had been noticed. It was an odd kind of gratitude, not specific, yet sincere, not personal, yet intimate in its gentleness. He wanted the letter to be a small warmth a stranger could hold, like a cup of tea pressed into cold hands. He dipped the pen and began slowly, letting the words come without ornament. "Thank you," he wrote, and paused, letting the phrase sit alone for a moment, as if it deserved space. Then he continued, for making it through the day. He wrote about small perseverances, about opening a door when one would rather stay under covers, about walking through wind, about speaking gently when fatigue makes sharpness easier. He did not write about himself. He did not mention redemption or regret. He kept his tone steady, as if the letter were written by someone calm and reliable, someone who did not require the reader to take care of him in return. When he finished, he read it once, then again, searching for any hint of drama or self-importance. A thank you letter can easily become a plea for recognition disguised as humility. He crossed out a line that sounded too elaborate and replaced it with something plainer. He shortened a sentence that lingered too long on sentiment. At last, he felt the letter had become what he intended: simple, warm, and light enough to be received without burden. At the bottom, he wrote, "No reply is needed," and beneath that, only rest. He folded the paper carefully, slipped it into the envelope, and sealed it with a plain press of the flap. No wax tonight. Wax might make it look official, and official things can frighten those who have learned to distrust attention. He wanted the envelope to look like something ordinary left behind accidentally, something a person might open without feeling they were stepping into obligation. He placed the envelope in his coat pocket, along with a second, smaller note, just a few lines of gratitude written on a scrap of paper, folded tightly. This one he intended to leave in a place where words could disappear into the dark without being traced back. Then he dressed, checked the fire's steadiness, and stepped into the crisp night. London, without fog, looked almost stern. The streets were darker between lamps, and the lamps themselves seemed brighter, their light hard-edged on wet stone. Scrooge walked his route with the same measured pace, though he noticed that in clear air his footsteps sounded louder, and he found himself stepping more lightly. He passed the bakery's closed front and the chandler's street, where the scent of wax seemed less noticeable now that the air carried everything away more quickly. He passed the alley of the late-lit window and saw, tonight, the window glowing again, a pale rectangle in the dark. He did not stop. He kept his eyes forward, letting the repetition of the route calm any impulse to linger. His first stop was the post office. At night, it was quieter than the station, but it held the same sense of contained purpose. A small lamp burned inside, and a clerk sat behind the counter with shoulders hunched against the cold that even indoor fires could not quite banish. Scrooge approached and asked for a stamp, his voice low, his manner unremarkable. The clerk slid a small sheet across the counter, and Scrooge chose one without fuss, pressed it to the envelope, and smoothed it with his thumb. He did not write a return address. He did not address the envelope with a specific name. Instead, he wrote, in careful letters, a general delivery address, a place where letters could be held, retrieved by those who asked. It was not perfect. It was, perhaps, an odd way to send a letter, yet it allowed the possibility that someone, somewhere, could claim it as theirs without having to be singled out. He dropped it into the slot and listened as it fell with a soft, final thud into the darkness of the box, a sound like a small decision made and released. From there, he continued to his second stop, a familiar doorstep not far from the late-lit alley. He had noticed this step on several nights, a pot of hardy plant left near the door, its leaves dull in winter but stubbornly alive. The door itself was plain, the paint worn, the handle polished by use. There was nothing dramatic about it, yet Scrooge felt drawn to it by a sense that someone inside lived with quiet endurance, the kind that rarely receives thanks. He did not know who they were. He did not want to know, but he wanted to leave the letter in a way that protected it from damp and from casual theft. He lifted the plant pot, slightly careful not to spill its sparse soil, and slid the envelope beneath its rim, where it would be sheltered. Then he set the pot back down with gentle precision, the way one sets down something fragile. The act felt oddly domestic, as if he were tidying a threshold rather than leaving a gift. He stepped back and moved away, letting the door remain closed and private. The third stop took him toward a church entry he had passed many times without entering. Its door was heavy, its stone steps worn smooth, and near the entrance stood a small box where people sometimes left coins or notes. The church was not lit brightly at this hour. Only a dim lamp glowed within, making the interior look like a quiet cavern. Scrooge did not go inside. He stood at the threshold and listened for a moment to the silence that seemed to gather there, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but held. Then he took the smaller folded note from his pocket and slipped it into the box. It was not a donation of money, but of words, 3 lines of gratitude that would likely never be read by him again. Perhaps it would be found by the caretaker. Perhaps it would be read by someone seeking shelter. Perhaps it would simply sit there, folded, until it was thrown away with other scraps. Scrooge accepted the uncertainty. The act itself mattered more than the outcome. He stepped back from the church steps and resumed his route, feeling the cold air sharpen around his cheeks. Walking home, he felt a different kind of quiet in his chest. Leaving letters did not produce the immediate satisfaction of leaving food or warmth. There was no sense of having eased a physical need, yet he sensed faintly, like the lingering scent of lavender on cloth, that he had placed something gentle into the night stream, something that might be caught by the right hands at the right time. When he reached his room, the warmth met him as always. He hung his coat, poured water into the kettle, and set it on the trivet. The familiar domestic motions grounded him, preventing his thoughts from swelling into pride or doubt. Then he opened the ledger and wrote the date. He paused, pen hovering, listening to the kettle's first faint stirring. At last he wrote, "Gratitude, even late, can still warm a room when it is written true." He set down the pen, poured his tea, and sat by the fire until the steam rose and dissolved into the air, trusting that somewhere in London, on a doorstep, in a box, in a quiet post office slot, his small words might find a reader who needed to feel, if only for a moment, that their endurance had been seen. On the 10th evening, the weather changed with the quiet decisiveness of a decision long contemplated. The first snow arrived not in a storm, not with drama, but in a soft, persistent drift that began at dusk and continued as the light failed, as though the sky had finally chosen to exhale something gentler than fog. From his window, Scrooge watched the flakes fall past the gas lamps and dissolve into pale sparks in their halos, and he felt, without quite knowing why, a deepening calm. Snow did not erase London's hardness. It merely covered it, smoothing the sharp edges for a time, offering the illusion of tenderness, and in doing so, sometimes inviting the true thing. The street stones, usually dark and wet, took on a lighter sheen. Footsteps softened. Even the city's distant noises seemed slightly muted, as if London itself were lowering its voice out of respect for the hush. Inside his room, the fire had been tended with unusual care. He had learned, over these nights, the small art of keeping coals alive without forcing them, and tonight he fed them early, building a steady warmth that would hold while he was away. The lamp burned with a patient glow. The table was clear, and the ledger lay closed beside it like a companion at rest. He stood for a long moment with his hands on the back of his chair, listening to the faint pop of coal and the soft whisper of snow against the window pane. A part of him wanted to think of this 10th route as an ending, a conclusion to the season's quiet work, a moment when he could close the ledger and feel finished. Yet he knew, with the sober humility of someone who had learned how little can truly be finished, that endings are often only pauses. The route had not been a project. It had become a way of living. Still, he allowed himself to mark the night as different, not in excess, not in grand gestures, but in the gentler choice of fewer parcels wrapped with more care. He would return to the bakery as he had on the first night, and take from it the warmth that began so many small comforts. A tin of biscuits, properly buttered, sealed against damp. He would pass again by the late-lit window, not to intrude, but to acknowledge the way a single square of light can make a street feel less lonely. He would end again at the lodging house hearth, leaving something shared where it could be taken without shame. The gifts would be modest, but the repetition would give them weight. If the route was to be his ritual, he wanted it to close the season as it had begun, with quiet, practical warmth. He wrapped first by habit, then by intention. A tin waited on the table, one he had bought earlier and kept tucked away, filled with biscuits, whose scent, even through the metal, suggested butter and sugar and safety. He tied it in cream paper, folded neatly at the corners, twine drawn snug. Beside it, he placed a small packet of black tea and wrapped that too, its paper making a soft, controlled rustle. For the third parcel, he chose something simple, a small bundle of kindling and a box of matches, wrapped in brown paper so it would not look precious. Fire, he thought, was the oldest warmth. A person near a hearth might not need biscuits as much as they needed the flame to hold a little longer. He tied the bundle with twine and pressed a small drop of wax to the knot, not for decoration, but for closure, the quiet mark of something completed. He stood back and looked at the 3 parcels, feeling their modest assurance. They did not glitter. They did not announce themselves. They simply waited to be carried. When he stepped outside, the cold met him with a clean bite, softened at once by the snow that caught on his coat and hat brim, melting into damp beads. The gas lamps seemed brighter against the white drift, their light falling onto the street in warm circles where snow briefly turned golden. Scrooge's footsteps made a faint crunch now, a sound almost intimate in the quiet. He adjusted his scarf and began his route, moving slower than he had on other nights, not because the snow demanded caution, though it did, but because the hush invited reverence. London under snow looked less like a machine and more like a sleeping creature. Its harsh lines softened, its breath visible in the air. He passed other figures now and then, their shoulders hunched, their faces turned down, and he noticed how the snow made even hurried people move more carefully. It was as if the city had been asked, briefly, to be gentle. The first stop was the bakery. Its window glowed warmly, brighter than the street outside, and the contrast made it look almost like a small hearth itself. When Scrooge entered, the heat wrapped around him at once, and the scent, butter, yeast, sugar, felt like a memory of comfort rather than an indulgence. The baker looked up and nodded, his hands dusted lightly with flour, his sleeves rolled as if winter could be kept at bay by work. Scrooge asked for a tin of butter biscuits and a packet of tea, though he already carried his own. He had learned that having an extra warmth available often served the night better than strict economy. The baker wrapped the tin with unhurried care, paper rustling softly, twine drawn tight with a sure pull. Scrooge watched the man's hands and felt again that quiet respect for steady labor. He paid, thanked him briefly, and stepped back out into the snow with the parcels heavier in his bag and the bakery's warmth lingering on his cheeks. The second stop drew him toward the late-lit window. The alley was narrower under snow, its stones partially covered, its bricks dark with damp. The fog, which had been absent earlier, seemed to gather here anyway, as if alleys held their own private mist. The window he had watched so often was lit tonight, and the pale rectangle of light fell onto the snow like a soft cloth. Scrooge slowed as he approached, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest, a quiet awareness of how close kindness can come to intrusion if one is careless. He kept to his rule: no knock, no waiting, no name. He chose the sheltered step where he had left biscuits on the first night, and he placed the tin and tea there again, arranging them so they would not slip, so the snow would not gather too quickly on the paper. The envelope he had once left was not repeated. Tonight, he left only the warmth of food and drink, the uncomplicated comfort of something edible and safe. As he straightened, he heard, faintly, a kettle begin to sing somewhere inside. The sound, so small and domestic, reached him through the door and brick and made the alley feel briefly less cold. For an instant, he saw movement behind the curtain, a shadow shifting, pausing. He stepped back at once, letting darkness take him in. The snow fell steadily, and in its hush, he felt the dignity of leaving without being seen. If the door opened and someone found the parcel, it would be theirs alone. His presence would not intrude upon that moment. He turned away and continued his route, his breath rising in pale clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. The third stop brought him to the lodging house. Snow had gathered along its step, and the building looked older under the pale covering, its worn surfaces more visible in the softer light. The common room's glow seeped through the lower window, and the faint orange of firelight looked inviting against the cold. Scrooge did not go inside. He had learned that the common room had its own delicate balance, and that even a quiet stranger could disturb it. Instead, he approached the side passage he knew, and found the familiar hearth chair visible through a cracked pane. Someone sat in it now, shoulders rounded, hands extended toward the low flame. Scrooge did not look long enough to study the figure. He kept his rule about not knowing. He set down the bundle of kindling and matches near the side entrance, tucked beneath the small overhang where Parcels could remain dry. He placed it beside the sill where he had once left bread and a tin cup, arranging it so it looked like it belonged there, like a practical object set down by someone passing through, rather than a gift meant to draw attention. Then, after a brief pause, he added the extra packet of tea he had purchased, tucking it into the fold of the paper so that whoever found the kindling would also find something to drink. The gesture felt complete in its simplicity: fire and tea, warmth and quiet. He stepped back into the snow and let the building return to its own life. The walk home was slower still, not because he was reluctant to return, but because the snow seemed to ask him to notice. Street corners looked softened, doorways gentler, the city's usual hardness temporarily veiled. He felt, as he walked, a faint stirring of something close to gratitude. Not gratitude for being praised, but gratitude for the chance to practice steadiness. He had not solved London. He had not redeemed all that he had once taken, yet he had, night after night, placed small warmth into the city's cold stream, and in doing so, he had changed something in himself. The route had become a kind of quiet prayer, not spoken, but walked. When he reached his rooms, he stamped the snow from his boots carefully so as not to bring the cold's wetness inside. He hung his coat on the stand, its fabric shedding damp slowly in the room's warmth. He unwound his scarf, set his hat aside, and placed the kettle on the trivet. The familiar sounds, the kettle's faint settling, the coal's soft pop welcomed him like a practiced closing. Then he opened the ledger beneath the lamplight. The page held the accumulating lines of his season's roots, each sentence plain, each date a quiet marker of repetition. He wrote tonight's date and paused, listening to the snow whispering against the window. In that hush, he found the words he needed, neither triumphant nor sorrowful, only steady. He wrote, "The route ends only for the season. The habit of warmth can continue, quietly, whenever the night returns." He set down the pen, closed the ledger with gentle care, and poured his tea. Sitting by the fire, he watched the flame's small movements and listened to London's softened breath under snow, allowing himself, at last, the simple comfort of knowing that in 3 small places tonight, a bakery's warmth carried outward, a doorstep softened by tea and biscuits, a lodging house offered a little more fire winter had been answered without noise. The snow continued for most of the night, then thinned toward morning, the way a held breath thins into ordinary air. When Scrooge woke, the light beyond his curtains looked cleaner, brighter, as if the city had been washed without being asked. He sat up slowly and listened. London, even under snow, was never truly silent, but the sounds arrived softened, cushioned by white. A distant wheel turned more gently. Footsteps made a hush rather than a scrape. Somewhere, a voice called out, not sharply, but with the practical tone of someone adjusting to slower streets. For a long moment, Scrooge remained where he was, not yet rising, allowing himself to feel the unfamiliar ease of a morning that did not demand he chase it. The room was cool. The fire had burned down to ash and a few dull coals, and the air carried the faint scent of last night's coal smoke and tea. He drew the quilt around his shoulders and felt with quiet clarity how different this was from the mornings he had once known, when he rose into a life that tightened around him like a fist. When he finally stood, it was with no urgency, only the steady rhythm of habit. He crossed to the hearth, stirred the ash with a poker, and found a few coals still alive in their patience. He fed them carefully, not with a greedy heap, but with small pieces arranged so that air could move and flame could gather without being forced. Soon the fire returned, first as a faint glow, then as a quiet flame that licked at the new coal and grew into warmth. He set the kettle on the trivet and watched as the metal began to darken with heat. These were now his morning gestures, not the snapping open of accounts, not the weighing of profit, but the small tending of warmth. In the old days, he had treated comfort as an indulgence, and sometimes as a weakness. Now he treated it as a duty first to himself, because a man who is always cold becomes hard, and then, in whatever modest way he could manage, to others. He did not walk the route that night, nor the next. The season's 10th night had felt like a closing, and he honored that closure by letting it rest. The ledger remained on the table, its cover closed, the leather warmed by the fire's quiet breath. He did not open it immediately, and he did not feel the itch to add more lines. He had learned that repetition is only soothing when it is chosen, not when it becomes another kind of chain. Instead, he lived his days with a gentler attention, allowing the route to become a presence in his mind rather than a compulsion in his feet. He still went out, of course, to buy bread, to walk in daylight, to feel London's air and observe its ordinary life. Yet he moved through the city now as someone who belonged to it, not as someone who stood apart and judged it. Snow lingered in corners for days, turning to gray along the curb, melting into damp that returned as fog. London resumed its usual textures, soot and stone and smoke, and with that return came the familiar winter weariness. Still, something had shifted, not in the city's nature, but in his own. Once, in a brief clearing afternoon, He walked past the corridor where he had tied the cushion to the chair. The landing was empty. The cushion remained, slightly compressed, as if someone had sat there recently. The ribbon ends hung neatly beneath the seat. The sight of it gave him a small, private steadiness. It was not evidence, not proof, not the kind of confirmation his old self would have demanded. It was simply an object, still doing what it had been meant to do, softening a hard place. He continued on without pausing too long, letting the moment pass as quietly as it came. Another day, as he crossed near the station, he saw a figure standing by the posted timetables, head tilted slightly as if reading carefully. The person's coat was plain, their posture neither hurried nor fully at ease. Scrooge did not stop. He did not look long enough to recognize any particular details, yet he felt, in the simple fact of someone reading a schedule, a faint stirring of hope that was not attached to a specific outcome. A train ticket was a small thing in a city's ocean of need. It might be used, or lost, or ignored. He had accepted that uncertainty when he left it. Now he accepted it again, reminding himself that kindness is not a contract, and that the only part he was responsible for was the leaving. There were nights, as winter deepened, when he felt an old restlessness try to return, the desire to do more, to expand the route, to add stops, to carry heavier parcels, to become, perhaps, a figure in the very stories he had once dismissed. Those nights, he sat by his fire and resisted the impulse not by denying it, but by understanding it. He recognized in it the old hunger for significance, the old habit of turning action into identity. He had learned, slowly, that the quietest forms of goodness are often the most stable, and that stability mattered more than spectacle. He did not need London to know him. He did not need strangers to speak his name with gratitude. In fact, he thought, the truest freedom he had found in these nights was the freedom to act without being seen. It was a relief, like setting down a heavy coat after carrying it for years. Sometimes he opened the ledger and read the entries, not as a man reviewing his own virtue, but as someone touching the edge of a practice that had steadied him. The sentences were plain, each one a marker of restraint. Light that does not demand to be seen, warmth sealed and left without sound, dignity returned in small repairs, comfort arriving like a whisper, a door closing on noise, leaving as healing, gratitude written true, the habit of warmth continuing. They were not poetry, not really, yet in their plainness, they held something that felt like a quiet map of his changed life. He did not add to the page unless he walked the route again, and he did not walk it unless he felt the same clean intention that had guided him at the beginning. The ledger, like the route, remained an instrument of steadiness, not a trophy. One evening, near the end of the week, London's fog returned with familiar softness, the lamps trembling in their halos as if the city were breathing through cloth again. Scrooge sat by his window with his tea and watched the street below, the blurred shapes of passers-by moving through damp air. He thought of the parcels he had left and the places he had visited, and he understood, perhaps more clearly than he had on any single night, that the route had done something subtle but profound. It had not only carried warmth outward, it had carved a rhythm inside him. In his former years, he had been a man of accumulation, gathering money and control, gathering hardness as if it were protection. Now he found himself practicing the opposite, leaving, releasing, loosening his grip. Each night he had walked the same circle and returned home empty-handed. And in returning empty-handed, he had learned that emptiness could be peace rather than lack. When the kettle began to murmur again on the trivet, he rose and poured fresh water for another cup. The fire threw a steady glow onto the table where the ledger lay. He touched its cover briefly, a gesture so small it barely qualified as an action. yet it carried meaning. Gratitude for the structure, for the ritual, for the chance to become reliable in gentler ways. He did not open it tonight. Instead, he turned the gaslight lower, letting the room soften into quieter shadow. He hung his coat on its peg as he always did, not because he had been out, but because the act itself signaled closure, a small declaration that the day could end without unfinished pursuit. He settled into his chair, cup warm between his hands, and allowed the night to be what it was, cold beyond the window, warm within the room, and somewhere in the city's vast, damp breathing perhaps a little softer than it might have been, simply because one man had learned to walk slowly, leave warmth behind, and go home without needing anyone to know.